This is Atomic Shinobi, and today I'm going to narrate second and final part of What If Kid Naruto was saved by Mizuri and her mother. If you enjoy this video, please like, share, and subscribe to this channel. And for more exclusive and spicy content, follow me on Patreon. Link is in the description below. And now, wasting no more time, let's start the story.
He put the note back on the table and smiled. Since Mizore's cooking last night had left all of the leftover food in the kitchen covered in yellow frost, Surara had gone to the village to purchase food. He was surprised that his cooking wasn't too bad last night. He had prepared Ona dishes in the same manner as they had, but he had added his own fiery energy in place of the ice Yuki. However, the heat in the rice caused the two Ona to eat very slowly. The yellow monsters had likely avoided his food for the same reason, ignoring the macabre possibility that his cooking might be so awful that it would have scared off even Mizore's. He turned to face the sun as he left the house. It always gave him more energy. The bright rays only made him stronger. The occasional chilly wind hardly affected him. He would frequently enjoy the sunshine back in the Leaf Village since it was his only source of relaxation. Now that he understood why, he grinned. In retrospect, he realized that the last few days had been the best of his life. He had found what he had always desired: respect, friendship, and family. Though she didn't exactly fit his conception of a mother, Surara was the mother he never had. However, he didn't give a damn because he wouldn't know anyhow. It was his first time having a mother. They were the people he loved. He felt like a human being with them, a vulnerable, everyday person who didn't have to worry about concealing every feeling or thought, someone who didn't have to overthink and examine everything out of fear of intricate and malevolent deeds. On the rare occasions when he had been briefly free, he certainly had, even if his false personality had never done so. Then Mizore, unconsciously grinning more brightly. There was a friend of his. The mere thought of it made him giddy once more. At long last, he had found a friend with whom he could play, laugh, and smile. Then he heard a voice. The voice of someone else in his new life. To your left, behind the tree. Even though he hadn't heard that voice in a while, not since he had claimed to be tired, someone was there. Kurama? Naruto inquired, a little taken aback by the abrupt shift in subject. Kurama remarked, I slept longer than I expected. It's good to hear you awake again, he said, turning to face his observer in the tree after receiving a mental acknowledgement from his guardian. A woman emerged from behind the trunk as he heard a startled squeak and asked, Can I help you? Her hair was brown, and she was dressed simply in an ankle-length pink kimono. Naruto asked, Who are you? He was aware that Surara and Mizore belonged to a village, but he had never visited or interacted with anyone from it. Amaya. You? She looked at him curiously, as if he were a unique oddity, and said, Naruto. Are you lost? Inquired Amaya. Even so, she had her doubts. Humans are unable to enter their village due to the barrier surrounding it. Despite her daughter, Sarera's home was inside the line. Know are you from the same village as Mizore? He asked, unaware of her thoughts. Amaya's face darkened as if a fuse had been lit. Amaya growled, Don't mention that murderer's name, to him. What? Shish. She fell to the ground after being struck in the face by a ball of snow. He turned abruptly toward it, startled, and saw Mizore staring down at the fallen woman. Mizore? She asked, gathering more snow from the ground instead of responding. Bitch! Exclaimed Amaya. As Mizore took Naruto's hand and tugged, causing him to falter a few paces, another snowball struck her face. Amaya exclaimed, Gaw! And flung herself to her feet before launching a shard at the girl with her ice claws. She dodged the shard by ducking, then threw another snowball, causing another outcry of indignation. Naruto was pulled by Mizore once more. Mizore pulled his hand once more, but he resisted, saying, Let's go. Worried, Naruto questioned, Why? She tugged once more and pleaded, Please. Naruto felt a surge of fear from her terrified eyes. Then another shard of ice flew in Mizore's direction. She instinctively lifted her left hand. A squelch. She let out a scream. She cradled her arm and let him go. She gave the other woman a glare that promised pain as she swiftly extracted the shard with her right. With her ice claws pointing at Mizore, Amaya grinned and said, Yes, that's it. Keep the murderer still. Naruto squatted down in front of Mizore, ignoring her taunt. The pain caused her to half close her eyes. The fragment had pierced her delicate skin, penetrating past the sleeve of her kimono. He positioned himself between the two Ona and held her by the shoulders for protection. Naruto glared at Amaya, turning his neck, and demanded, Why are you attacking and calling Mizore a murderer? Mizore's eyes snapped open. Oh? You don't know? No. She squeezed them shut once more, saying, Know what? The pain was excruciating. Please. You didn't tell him, did you? Amaya sang in a charming voice. She no longer felt the need to hurl another shard at the girl out of retaliation. No, there was something much more painful she could do. Her response was validated by the boy's inquisitive glance. She smiled. That thing there is a freak. She. Shut up. Mizore lunged out of a startled Naruto's grasp, disregarding the pain radiating from her arm. It had not sufficed. A week had not been sufficient. More time with him was what she needed and wanted. Amaya and Mizore crashed into the snowy ground after Mizore threw herself at her. After mercilessly pulling her head back while clutching her hair, she shoved a mouthful of snow into the woman's mouth. She swiftly overturned them and slammed Mizore into the ground after becoming alarmed by the girl's outburst. She seized Mizore's wrists and pinned them to the ground, freezing them there with an angry composure. She caused the hysterical girl to freeze by placing the sharp edge of one of her claws beneath her neck. Her smile returned with ease. As she spoke slowly, Amaya extended the girl's agonized expression and said, Mizore is unstable, prone to kill anyone around her with her powers. What? Don't lie. Mizore hasn't even developed her powers yet, Naruto replied. Amaya smiled at him like a Cheshire cat. She lied to you obviously. Why else do you think she lives here isolated from the village? Naruto hesitated before uttering another defense. Even though he didn't want to question Mizore, he could tell that she was telling the truth. What made her lie to him, then? He began to doubt himself, and a voice in the background mockingly told him how foolish he had been to think he could truly trust someone. His gaze shifted from the woman's face to Mizore's stricken and injured figure. She had told him a lie. Her face was marred by leaking tears. Her gaze had shifted to the sky, unfocused and aimless. However, she was crying, and Mizore was crying, too. She was no longer having difficulty. Her body was relaxed and motionless. She had given up. It's similar to me and Kurama, Naruto reflected solemnly. Before he knew it, the words, Mizore, had escaped his lips. Even though he hadn't told them to, his legs had begun to move. Then she turned her head to face him feebly. It was painful. His heart tightened. Then he understood why. I'm still your friend Mizore. Was it his imagination, or did her eyes slightly enlarge? I don't care that you lied to me. I don't care that you might snap and try to kill me one day. Her conflicted eyes were filled with shock, surprise, and disbelief. She heard him say, when it happens, if it happens, I'll be there to help. Her gaze wavered. He didn't imagine it. With his hands on her arms, he whispered, after all, I'm your friend, right? Weakly, she said, Naruto, but no more was required. She was aware that he was aware. She felt naked in front of him, but not in an unpleasant way because she could see his eyes beyond hers. Mizore sobbed. She had really made a friend. The rest of the world didn't seem to matter as much anymore. However, she could hear the sound of snow falling on her ears. Naruto had not noticed, but Mizore's eye widened. Die. She didn't think it took more than a second. She kicked Naruto back in search of it. She needed the power she had longed for and detested throughout her life. Her hands got greasy, and her hair went cold. Her bindings snapped, and she clenched her hands. She let her power rage and slammed her hands to her left. Her pure might was evident, unbridled and unrestrained. Their attacker's clawed hand was frozen halfway through the wall of ice, which was thicker and taller than she was. Amaya ripped her hand free in a cry of shock and indignation. She fled, shooting her a fear-filled, hateful glance. Eyes squinted. She wouldn't escape without suffering. Her wound was covered by the ice that crawled up her arm from her fingers. She felt her power surge again, filling her arms and her entire being as she raised her hands as though possessed. Arg! She whirled around, her blood pounding frantically. Her eyes narrowed as she focused on the sound and saw a lifeless body. Like an executioner brandishing a sword, she raised her hands. She hesitated, and then her hands began to shake. Naruto! She exclaimed anxiously, forgetting her earlier murderous rage. She ran in the direction of her fallen friend. She dragged me down. There was a pause in her movements, prior to forcing herself to ignore it. Sorry. Exploded out of her mouth. She knelt beside him, her arms reaching out, but she held them back. Despite being face down on the chilly ground, Naruto felt a sense of relief. Her desire to see his face was uncertain at this point. Her voice was tainted by guilt as she asked, Are you okay? He remained silent. Was he angry? Her throat got stuck. Nah, Naruto? She tentatively pressed her hand against his shoulder. He let out a little moan. Naruto. Fear and doubt gave way to worry. She flipped him over with a firm, urgent grip on his shoulder. She gasped in disbelief at what met her. Where she had kicked him, his torso was covered in ice, which was still spreading, ice that had come from her, She pulled her hand away as if it had been burned. She yelled, "Naruto," in the hopes that he would awaken. He didn't. Her movements were laced with panic. She clamped her claws down on the ice in a desperate attempt to scrape it off. She was in a desperate situation, but she was also careful not to accidentally cut him with her sharp hands. She was unfazed by the piercing screech the ice made as she clawed at an inappropriate angle. She broke off pieces of the ice, but it didn't stop the ice from getting bigger. "Naruto!" she yelled, giving him a rough, hysterical shoulder shake. His eyelids briefly flickered before he said, "Wake up, use your fire. Wake up, please," she exclaimed as something wet pricked her eyes, trickled down her cheek, and landed on her trembling hands. "Please," she cried as she gave him a tight hug. Her throat resisted her half-formed, blubbering pleas. A sarcastic voice sighed, "Tisk, can't leave him alone for a minute." "What?" Mizore blinked wildly, but her vision remained blurry. She was shocked and listened to the growling command, "Remove yourself from him now." She watched in horror as Naruto's body was violently flung to the ground, and she fled backwards with it. What was she doing? Had they been correct all along? Had she been crazy all along? Imog is playing. She paused her thoughts. For less than a second, Naruto was enveloped in a flash of yellow energy. In an instant, the snow surrounding him turned into a puddle and miraculously stopped in front of her. However, she didn't find that particularly concerning. The only thing she could do was watch in sheer relief as the ice on his body rapidly melted and vanished in an instant. Then she struck the floor. Her head abruptly snapped forward, her eyes blurring, her ears thudding, and her entire world jerked. And then, like a doll thrown too hard, the rest of her body fell apart. She dug her claws hard into the ground, biting her lips stubbornly. She nearly screamed as she forced her weight onto her limbs, but now her lips were bleeding. The ripped muscles in her left hand failed to support her adequately, and it shook and gave way. She forced herself up onto her legs with almost overwhelming determination. Her gaze quickly shifted to her friend. She looked into his bewildered eyes, but instead she saw the genuine comprehension. She was lulled at that moment by a certain comfort. Standing feeble but magnificently in her new shape, all she could do was smile. Then she lost control of the world. Nobody would want to see a battle-torn field directly outside their house, especially a mother with a daughter and her friend. She changed from her leisurely pace to a quick, almost frantic one. Her critical gaze roamed around, analyzing and observing. Blood, body, shaped depressions in the snow, shards of ice, and a rather enormous ice wall that she would have explored at any other time. Surara felt her heart leap. She immediately tossed her groceries aside before yelling as she charged through the front door. "Mizore," she called out, but got no response, so she prepared for a potential conflict by letting her ice claws appear. Especially when she saw the red droplets on the floor and her heart began to race. "Naruto." She froze after that, remaining silent while straining to hear even the slightest movement. "LP," she heard, though it was broken and muffled. The fact that there were red stains all over the path leading to her daughter's room only made her concerns worse. She pushed open the door to her daughter's room as soon as her senses found the two who weren't behind it. But do so cautiously in case any attacker was skilled at hiding. A bone chilling sight greeted her. Her daughter's breathing was shallow and barely audible, and she appeared paler than usual. Naruto was desperately pressing a red, stained, blood-dripping towel onto Mizore's arm. She saw his fingers, which were white and trembling from effort, as he sobbed, "The bleeding won't stop." He stared at them, in terror, tears streaming down his cheeks. She forced herself to move forward, fighting the fear that had held her back. She swallowed and placed her palm over Naruto's. He nodded tremblingly and she felt his stiff movement beneath her fingertips. "Let go, okay?" he asked. She moved as soon as his hands were gone. She skillfully moved the towel aside and used her abilities to coat her daughter's arm in ice. Now that she could see the wound, her stomach turned. The fact that she was unable to sense her daughter's body healing appropriately was even more concerning. When their wounds were covered in ice, Yuki, Ona who had acquired their abilities typically recovered more quickly. What happened? There were only a few plausible explanations for her daughter's abnormal ice healing. His voice was shaky as he said, We were attacked by another Yuki, Ona, Amaya." The name caused her eyes to narrow. She would eventually have to pay her dues, and that clarified the situation. Naruto whispered, will she be all right?" Her thoughts stopped. Nor was she certain. Her daughter's cut was deep, severing muscles, but a superficial wound wouldn't have mattered. She pulled Naruto into an embrace in an attempt to ease his anxiety and to relax herself. She will be fine, but," she said. She wasn't sure if it would be safe to use her own energy to remove the foreign energy from her daughter's arm. That other Yuki. Ona left her energy in Mizore's hand. It's preventing her from healing normally. Her daughter's arm would probably become a battlefield of energies because their energies were so similar that there would be no obvious winner between her energy and Amaya's taint. They pushed her back. What? She gazed at Naruto in confusion. What is he? Naruto's eyes suddenly blazed with determination. Looking at her steadily and resolutely, Naruto begged, please, maintain the ice. She tentatively nodded and put a hand on her daughter's, drawing her icy energy into the ice. Naruto then put his on the ice. Confused, she looked up. She felt her energy strain, and her eyes widened in alarm. A thin tendril of his fiery power was slowly but surely making its way through the ice as he forced his energy into it. If her powers hadn't kept the ice frozen, the heat would have melted it long ago. Her concern only increased as she glanced up at him. His eyes weren't Naruto's. They were blank, unfocused, and slightly glazed, as if he were possessed. A second source was detected by her senses. She gaped in disbelief. Naruto didn't own it. It was more ancient, older. It encased Naruto's power tendril, urging and directing it. It dispersed and molded Naruto's energy, forming it into and around Mizore's wound. When Mizore's wound began to literally sew itself shut, much faster than a Yuki, Ona's typical healing time, her eyes could only get wider in shock. It was finished in a minute. Only a red line remained where her daughter's wound had been when the tendril emerged from the ice. Naruto? She asked in a gentle but inquisitive tone as she thoughtfully looked into his eyes. Anxiety surged. She had hardly noticed the fear in Naruto's eyes when they had first met, but it wasn't concealed this time. In front of her eyes, it was frighteningly vulnerable, too visible, and too exposed. Then his mouth opened a little, and he confessed, his voice softer than even her daughter's normal whispers. I have a secret. Her breathing was the first thing she felt. Mizore creaked open her eyelids as she slowly came to. She encountered her bedroom's well-known ceiling. Her window provided a gentle ambient glow that illuminated everything. Few rays passed through the partially drawn curtains. Then she thought, when had she fallen asleep? Her eyes popped open, but she realized she was carrying too much weight when she attempted to sit up. She noticed a familiar mop of blonde hair and her eyes darted down. It carried a delicate glow in the surrounding light. However, it now made sense why she believed her hand was waking slowly. Nevertheless, her sensible mind suddenly interrupted with an all-too important question, even though her initial reaction was to enjoy her friend's company. What took place? She gave a slight lift of her eyebrow. She let a lock of hair fall into her face. She instinctively raised her left hand to swipe it aside, but she hesitated due to a strange itching sensation. When she tentatively raised it above her, she noticed that her arm was neatly wrapped in bandages. Then she recalled. Her breath became labored. Her arm didn't hurt. Why? Itching was not the only effect of deep wounds. But she wasn't particularly worried about that. She slowly, almost hesitantly, craned her neck and returned her gaze to her friend's face. He had told the truth. She pulled him up next to her with tenderness and gentleness without thinking about it. She put her arms around him and stared at him, wide-eyed, motionless, and breathing, as if she were afraid that if she disturbed what appeared to be a dream, it would all vanish. Then, gradually, the belief set in. She lowered her head into his chest and slowly leaned into him. She took a deep breath and was filled with his scent as she briefly felt his warmth. The air then rushed and ran away with a trembling quaver. It began. Her throat felt constricted, and tears began to well up. Then a quiet, muffled cry, a sob. She buried herself in his presence and started crying, allowing her feelings to spill out as tiny tremors shook her body. Her companion. Weakly, she croaked, Naruto, and gave him another hug. A dim glow had glowed on her wrist for just a minute. It didn't disappear. Witnessing the suffering or death of those he cared about caused him anguish and heartache. It never completely disappeared, though it did become more bearable with each new person he met during his lengthy life. Wearing a face that shouldn't have been his, Kurama watched in concern as Naruto's walking almost created a circle in his mind. Ever since the fight, when he had sensed the first surge of panic in the boy's mind, he had been watching. Then, all the way through his watch over said Yuki, Ona friend to his confession to his friend's mother. Unfortunately, when it became apparent that the blonde would completely refuse sleep for his friend, he had to pull Naruto into his own world. He was concerned about Naruto, and Naruto was concerned about his friend Yuki, Ona. He was able to recognize them with ease. Worry, frustration, and anger, for his friend, the circumstance, and his own helplessness. And he would assist Naruto in the same way that he had been assisted. He said, "It won't help, you know." The frantic blonde was startled out of his reverie by his voice, and he looked around in bewilderment before meeting him, seemingly realizing for the first time where he was. Then a look of horror took over his face. Why had he come here? He closed his eyes for a moment, exhausted, and went on. Walking around like that, staring off blankly into nowhere, scolding yourself. Naruto's eyes grew wide, displaying both shock and rage. Worrying over your friend to the point that you'd forego needed rest and reason. What would you accomplish? Asked Kurama. What? Naruto muttered, unsure of what to say because so many different emotions were overwhelming him that he was unable to think. You'd simply become weaker, less able, but Mizore is. Kurama laced his words with accusations, saying, think. You don't like it that she was hurt, but what could you have done? Before he could respond, Naruto abruptly stepped back, uncertain. I could have protected her. Could you? Up against an opponent far more experienced than you, not to mention your elemental weakness. Then. Naruto muttered, his eyes dropping too fast and his voice feeble. What do I do? Kurama turned to him and glared at him, asking, what do you want to do? Naruto came back with a bewildered and irritated expression. As I said, think, Uzumaki, think. Kurama could see that the name change brought back memories in his manner and aura. Kurama grinned. Now, what do you want to do? Naruto's glance at him restored a cozy familiarity that he had sorely missed. Uzumaki's power, intelligence, and skill were fueled by an unwavering, burning determination that was the cause of their accomplishments. He could now cherish and nurture it, something he had really missed. His hope and assurance that the Uzumaki was still alive lay in the young hatchling in front of him. As the strongest of the 9 guardians and as someone who was merely hoping again, he would serve his charge to the best of his abilities out of honor, loyalty, and love. That was a personal pledge he made to himself, a pledge from an elderly and weary person who had discovered that he could believe again. The first thing he would do after their conversation was over would be to speak with a particular woman. She viewed the world with as much composure as she could muster. She was still able to move fluidly and her legs did not shake, but she could never be truly at ease. She had undoubtedly acknowledged that her daughter's friend possessed an ancient power, and she had undoubtedly complied when informed that the guardian of that power was her daughter. After all, if her daughter's treatment in her own village served as an example of how people who are special are treated, that would explain his sadness. She had therefore listened to his confession with an open mind, particularly in light of what she believed to be proof of what he might have said. She had anticipated some tears and had given him a comforting, warm hug when he was done. She wasn't gone. She then wished Naruto a good night and kissed her daughter good night before settling into her bed. She had no idea what she was doing or how long she had been sitting motionless on her bed, silently thinking and contemplating. But she had really not anticipated what had happened next, even with her cautious thoughts about what she had learned in a single night and all of her considerations and thoughts. Her world had changed in the moment she had closed her eyes to blink. She was in a warm, humid, and probably tropical forest instead of sitting on her bed, deep in thought. The entire scene was rather strange, especially with the regal-looking man perched on a low tree branch. She blinked as a result. She remained in the woods. The man said, "This isn't a dream, I assure you." "Ah." Surara said, "I see, may I ask then, who are you?" She nearly dismissed the slight smirk that appeared on his lips as a trick of the light. "I've already been introduced Shirayuki-san, by my charge, your daughter's friend," he said. She nodded slowly as she drew links, but all she could do was stare blankly. He smiled briefly and said, "Kurama-san then? Naruto, Kun's guardian?" Surara said, "It is nice to finally meet you." Kurama answered, "The same may be said for you." Surara bowed respectfully and said, "Thank you for healing my daughter's arm." His reply caused her to pause, but when she heard a scoff, her eyes instantly shot back, forming an angry glare. His eyes seemed to be fixed on the sky as he explained, "Don't thank me, I wouldn't have been able to do it without you as I can't smoothen my Yuki flow while I'm in Naruto. Your ice provided enough resistance, so you should thank yourself." He appeared to consider the statement for a while as he gazed at her thoughtfully before responding with a courteous nod. "But still, you didn't even have to do that much, so I am still grateful." Feeling content, Surara took another look around her. "So, where am I?" inquired Surara. "We are, for lack of a better word, in Naruto's mind, or at least a small portion of it that I can control," Kurama concluded. With a guarded accusation, she said, "May I assume, then, that you brought me here?" Kurama answered, "And you would be right." He asked, "Would you like some tea?" Almost instantly, landing gracefully on his feet before she had a chance to ask any more questions. With an automatic response, Surara said, would be fine. Her ability to respond appropriately and correctly was ingrained in her from years of experience serving on the village council. Tea was an official gathering where topics of relative importance were occasionally discussed. All she could do now was hope her experience was sufficient. Come then. He nodded once in acknowledgement, and she trailed behind him. Slowly, observingly, her eyes followed the sights. Her footsteps were in time with his as she followed silently, but she never made a crunch when her feet touched the ground. It was a deliberate effort, though. Even though she was temporarily trapped, her body was still tense, as most people would be in the presence of a creature that could quickly flatten a mountain with just a thought. Her concerns were exacerbated by the fact that said being had essentially made her conscious mind appear in a strange environment. Her thoughts would also not be secure. The creature that had been the focus of her worried thoughts abruptly said, "You don't have to be so stressed, you know." She was startled, and her next move resulted in an audible smack. Without pausing, he said, "The only reason I could even bring you here was because you were open and to some degree connected to Naruto." He slowed down a little to indicate that she needed to catch up. "Naruto?" asked Surara. Kurama phrased it as one, but his tone was more akin to a statement. "In just about a week, it already feels like he's a part of your family, doesn't it?" Surara was about to respond when she paused, realizing that what he had said was true. "Especially so with your daughter, correct?" Kurama said emotionlessly, his feet having stopped some time ago. She never liked being led too blindly in a conversation, so her uneasiness grew. The guided conclusions he was forcing her to confront only made her fantasies worse, and she had no idea what his ultimate objective was. Then she realized. Softly and vulnerably, she asked, What do you want?" She only had a few decades of experience in the fixed setting of her village council, so it would be illogical for her to be able to outsmart a creature with tens of centuries of experience, particularly when she was on his property. Before he abruptly became a person, her anxious eyes merely observed his expression remain emotionless. He teased, "You can stop those dreadful thoughts too, by the way." All she could do was give him a confused look in return. Kurama posed the rhetorical question, "Besides, we have a common interest, don't we?" Surara arched an eyebrow at that moment, then slowly let it fall as she realized the implicit implication. She answered, "I guess we do. For them." Suddenly he stiffened. Her breathing became labored, and she froze. Then he turned, grinning. Her surroundings blurred in an instant, and then a new scene emerged. They were standing in a tiny clearing now. A modest bed was spread out in front of her, and the simple furniture was illuminated by the setting sun on the horizon. Two identical chairs with elaborate backrests were placed on a lovely oak coffee table. They were surrounded by tall, flowing grass that was golden from the sun's rays. They left her speechless. Two tiny portions of strawberry were on the table, and matching forks were placed beside them. Their original topic, a beautiful tea set, was placed in the center. "Now then, what kind of tea would you like?" "I feel it too, it's definitely from within this barrier," Kazushi replied. Miyuki muttered, "It's familiar, isn't it?" "It is," Kazushi remarked. They sensed that the energy he had was too much like their own. It wasn't the signature of another phoenix. One of their daughters immediately came to mind. After their house was destroyed, they had never located her body. Perhaps. Kazushi said, "Are we entering now?" A day earlier, Miyuki had discovered the location and had given a signal. Miyuki pointed to the kanji and lines she had tattooed into the ground and said, "No, this barrier is stronger than the others around here, so I'm not exactly sure. I've been preparing an infiltration seal that's 3 times quieter than the pre-made ones we've been using. Though, the snowy ground is making it hard to set seals properly. In order to keep her markings on the snow, she had to draw and solidify them in a matter of seconds, but the soft ground kept getting in the way. For fear that the barrier might have a sensory function, she dared not even use clones. The amount of Yuki she would need to use to create clones would be like setting off a flare, in contrast to setting ink with Yuki, which used almost no Yuki but required a lot of concentration. Kazushi sighed wearily and said, "I'll do the setting then." It was always much harder to be precise than to use sheer force to force something. Other than Miyuki's grateful nod, they didn't require a signal. As a team and a couple, they had been together for so long that their coordination was almost automatic and effortless. At the cautious pace they were taking, they would likely only be able to create a significant enough opening in the barrier by the end of the week, given the additional challenge of cold, windy, snow-filled conditions. Surara, sitting cross-legged across Naruto, said, "Calm yourself first, then concentrate fully on the fire. Now focus on the energy you're using to sustain it." She saw the flame begin just inches from his palms and burn steadily in his hands. Their mental conversation had taught her a lot about Naruto's guardian. It turned out that, on a basic level, Yuki manipulation was essentially the same for all kinds of Yuki. She couldn't coach Naruto in that area because each Yuki type had distinct characteristics that were unquestionably different, but since he could already release some from his flame, it wouldn't be a huge deal. Now picture that flow of Yuki, maybe like a river. Try to constrict the flow, to reduce it as much as possible without stopping it and extinguishing the flame. She observed the symptoms of stress. Too rigid breathing, tense arms, and a slightly wrinkled face. She had to acknowledge Naruto's talent as she directed her own attention to the flame. The flame had shrunk to the size of her thumb. In fact, it was less than a fifth of her thumb. According to what Kurama had told her, Naruto's kind could generate a comfortable amount of flames. However, Kurama did not specify what kind of yokai they could produce, and they needed very little effort or energy to create fire when they were in their comfortable zones. So little that, in theory, Naruto could keep his whole body covered in fire forever. However, the difficulty increased exponentially as they went beyond their comfort zone. The challenge for a small flame was to keep the Yuki flowing in a tiny but accurate and steady stream. Control and Yuki cost were the challenges for a big flame. If there was too little, the flame would go out. If there was too much, it would burn uncontrollably. Naruto had undoubtedly stepped outside of his comfort zone. After flickering, the flame abruptly grew larger. It died in the next second. It was easy to see the mounting frustration. Take a rest, it's easier to let Yuki flow when you're calm and relaxed, she concluded. He let out a weary sigh after his hands abruptly fell. If the sun's position was any indication, he had been training for at least 3 hours. He gave Surara a nod of approval, then leaned back and collapsed on the ground. His body hurt now, but the sky remained as blue as it had been in the morning. It felt like he had just finished a very long and agonizing jog because his arms were tired and his entire body was weak. Then, it was made even worse by a constant tingling sensation in his head. He felt as though something was calling to him, but the sensation would pass quickly. He refocused his thoughts and gave his head a slight shake. She gazed up at the afternoon sky, where leaves were falling freely and occasionally being blown by the wind. The day was pleasant, really pleasant. A small smile appeared on her face as her thoughts returned to a particular blonde. Then, as soon as she saw another leaf fly by her window, it disappeared. She was trapped inside. She was more or less confined to her bed. She eyed the leaf as it flew behind the wall and out of her line of sight, feeling jealous of it for some reason. For a moment, she sat motionless. Then she sat up, huffing. She had a gut feeling that she would eventually receive it from her mother. However, she was not and most definitely was not going to be deterred by that subtle reminder. She opened the window and stood motionless as the chilly outside air welcomed her. She was feeling better already. Her face flashed a tiny smile. She dropped and climbed out with ease. With a gentle thud, she hit the snow and ran without turning around. Although she was aware that her mother merely wanted to confirm that she was truly recovered, she felt perfectly well. Even the phantom pains she had experienced after waking up had vanished, and the only scar left by her wounds was a faint line on the arm where she had been cut the deepest. Her forced bed rest had nearly driven her insane. She therefore attributed her complete boredom, induced stupidity to it. Without realizing it, her mind automatically brought up another image of the blonde. If Naruto had been with her, her time in bed would not have been nearly as awful. At the very least, they could have played games. However, Naruto had come to ask her first if she would mind after her mother had asked him 3 days prior if he wanted to begin his training. She had said no in a dumb way. Now she truly detested herself. She hesitated, wondering where to go. Her mother knew almost every one of her favorite places. No, her mother knew them all. Is it really worth it for her to try to hide from her mother? Later on, she would only make her punishment worse. She let her shoulders drop and then laughed nervously. Then she froze, and then she smiled again. She stifled another laugh and shook her head slightly, indicating that she was at risk of acquiring some of Naruto's habits because she was him. She glanced around, thinking that perhaps if she picked the closest one, her mother wouldn't be too upset with her afterwards. After another moment of contemplation, she turned and bolted. She abruptly stopped once more. This time, she let out a quiet, foolish, self-aware complaint. Geez, she was definitely influenced by Naruto. She didn't need to hide because it wasn't like he was present. A bit of streamlined ice formed beneath her as she narrowed her focus, but she scowled as she dug her fingers into the snow nearby. She should have apologized to her friend. She went from standing motionless to racing through trees that flashed by her eyes with a quick flick of her hands. Her frown was quickly replaced by a sloppy smile. As she was walking to her location, her mind abruptly shifted to her mother because she couldn't get rid of the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Her thoughts strayed for a moment. How did she appear from above? Perhaps she resembled a tiny shadow racing across the frozen landscape, swerving under the odd tree. She gradually approached a little patch of green up ahead. There was a hot spring nearby that was surrounded by a thick, sizable tree ring. However, it was most likely because the hot springs were the largest she had ever seen. It was the size of a respectable lagoon, despite the fact that it was actually several springs that just so happened to be in the same location. She was unaware that her mother had prepared a small surprise for her. She ought to have recalled one small aspect of her life. It was always her mother or fate. They worked together to guide her lift, with her mother being the closest and most likely the more cunning of the two. When she eventually reached the small clearing in the center where the water was, she found herself in a difficult situation. Fire. His eyes briefly met hers before closing again to focus on what he was doing between his palms. Heat had never been Mizore's thing. She was believed to do so from birth, and the idea was further reinforced by the fact that she is an ice creature. Her entire existence had been a frozen tundra of snow, ice, and the well. Known cold all around her. It was reflected in her own powers. But life had dealt her a rough hand, and she had no friends like her for years. After years of seclusion, her first creation had to be a fire yokai. That hadn't really bothered her, though. In fact, she had been astonished, but she felt at ease with his personal warmth. She hadn't given it much thought, even after he had gone and developed his powers, which included shooting and setting fire. Ultimately, it had been a minor cost for her friendship. She had never imagined, though, that she would eventually find herself viewing fire in a new light. Was friendship capable of making one intoxicated and euphoric? She had been getting them a lot lately, and as she stared, another smile appeared on her face. Her lips were robbed of another breath, perhaps. She heard herself murmur, "It's beautiful." Her eyes were stopped in awe as the dancing lights flashed from palm to palm in complex patterns. The fire's tempo followed, as if a crescendo were building. Between Naruto's hands, which he held with his palms facing each other, it shrank, then grew, flew up, and then flew back down. The flaming performance intensified, building to a crescendo, and then it turned straight up after swirling and flowing in smaller and faster circles. The pattern of the light reflected off her face was the same. After that, it continued to rise until it reached its highest point. It released sparks that twinkled softly in a single, lovely burst, adding to the enchantment of her mesmerized eyes. Somewhere during the performance, she hadn't even noticed that her breathing had slowed. Mizore muttered, "I wish I could do something that beautiful with my powers." Naruto's face, which had been tense with concentration, gradually relaxed. It was amazing for his skill development and mental capacity to bend and guide fire in such patterns, as he performed with complete focus. His thoughts could vanish and he would only be able to concentrate on his abilities. However, at the time, it forced him to the limit of his ability to control his powers. Naruto let out a deep breath, opened his eyes, and his facial wrinkles gradually eased. He blinked once, then looked up with a smile. He gave her a small smile and said, "I know you can. You just haven't done it yet." She gave him a stupid look in response, and then she blushed slightly. She asked, "Do you really think so?" Naruto reassured him, "Yeah, in fact, you could even try it now, maybe make a shape with your ice? A star maybe?" She fidgeted with her fingers in contemplation, chewing her lip absently. With a whisper, "Okay," she raised both of her hands at her sides. For a moment, she pictured a star, commanding her power. In an instant, a small, crude, strange-looking ball with protruding spikes materialized. Horror bubbled up to a certain level. She heard him ask, "Try again?" And, like a switch, dropped the deformed ball before attempting to create a star again. A smaller ball than the first formed, this one appearing to have been bitten from the side by some messy, painful creature. A new sensation reappeared. Wasn't she disappointing Naruto? She pondered anxiously. She resisted the urge to glance up. She didn't want to see his likely disappointed expression. Naruto softly repeated what Surara had told him when he had failed earlier. "Try taking it slowly, Mizore. Imagine it forming slowly, instead of immediately picturing it. Take your time." As she followed his instructions, a tiny ball started to form between her palms. But as the tiny ball grew, she squeezed her eyes shut. In an attempt to fit her mental image, the ice was growing and protruding in various places. 10 seconds passed before it finally rested in its final configuration. She opened her eyes almost anxiously, but with hope. She felt sick to her stomach. She could see that the ice was larger than the last two and appeared more solid. The 5 points that ought to have made a star, however, weren't even 5. Instead, they just protruded at strange angles and at disproportionate heights. He had forgiven her despite the fact that she had lied to him, had that lie exposed during a tortoise fight, and hurt him in addition. She was unable to fulfill his requests, and she hadn't even expressed regret. She felt undeserving. Her small hands clenched as the ball fell. She looked up and saw that Naruto was scowling. Her voice was a whisper. "I'm sorry, I just can't," Mizore continued. He made no move to let her know that he had acknowledged anything, and there was absolutely no response. Why? Was he angry? Mizore pondered. He abruptly said, "Mizore, transform." What? She asked, looking up at him. His head tilted curiously to the side as he repeated, "Yeah, transform. It'd be easier for you to use your powers in that form, right?" She was aware of Naruto's statement that he didn't mind her having abilities at such a young age. She was aware of that, but she also knew that she still lacked the ability to feel at ease in her new form, particularly in front of him. After all, she had hurt him in that state, and she didn't want to have the opportunity to do it again. "Mizore," she said, meeting his reassuring gaze. "However, transform," he said in a kind, supportive voice. So she did. She felt her hands get frosted and her hair turn to ice as she allowed her inner energies to flow. "Now try." She raised her hands once more and inhaled deeply. She closed her eyes slowly, willing her Yuki to flow. This time, the form in her head felt correct, much more real and connected. She sensed and knew that it was over. She slowly opened her eyes to see a breathtaking star. "See?" A hint of trembling crept into her breath, but as she cautiously and slowly ran her fingers over the smooth ice in silent wonder, the corners of her mouth slowly pulled upward. As far as she could feel or see, it remained smooth and perfect, with not a single crack, and it occasionally sparkled like it had been expertly sculpted with a hammer and chisel. Something grew inside of her. It was a little overflowing, somewhat joyful dance that was difficult to describe, but it seemed to make her more alive and the world brighter. In an instant, she joyfully leaned forward and put her arms around Naruto. Oh no, it was much more than just the fact that she had become famous. Her abilities had always been something she detested, something lethal and destructive that made her so horribly different. She had never considered her own power to be beautiful, just as she had never considered fire to be beautiful. She wanted to laugh, cry, or just cry with joy because of that tiny euphoric wonder that filled her. "Thank you," she said in a half scream. He blushed slightly and gave her a gentle hug in return, saying, "Hey, you're welcome, Mizore." He believed that he would smile as long as his friend did. However, they also broke apart in less than a second. "Ah, there you are, Mizore." As they both staggered to meet Surara, a faint squeak and a slightly louder cry came from the two of them. She gave off the tiniest hint of a tease, but neither child saw it. With only a smile that actually made Mizore wriggle, Surara said, "So, Mizore, would you like to explain why I didn't find you in bed?" Mizore played with her fingers and swallowed. Her mother was the best at reading body language, so even though she said, because I'm here, her own body language was tense. Surara's cheerful disposition remained constant. Would her daughter notice, she wondered, or would she not be old enough to comprehend? Pointing back at her daughter, she swept her gaze over them both. It was rare that she was in her transformed state. She looked back at Naruto and then at her daughter, raising a mental eyebrow. She ignored their flushed faces and allowed her gaze to stray to the star that Mizore's claws were gripping. It appeared that they had also noticed her gaze. As Naruto raised the last part of his own sentence, Mizore nearly choked. About this, I was helping Mizore?" Even though she had asked, Mizore knew it wasn't a question. I think I see with what too. Can I look at it closer?" Mizore shuffled slowly forward, holding the star in front of her eyes. Surara's eyes widened momentarily, but neither child noticed. Then, struggling to keep her smile from twitching, she began to laugh in her head, almost hysterically. Even though everything was moving more quickly than she could have anticipated, everything was still moving in the direction she had intended. "It's beautiful, Mizore. You made this? With Naruto's help?" The ice star wasn't perfect in the sense that it had no edges or cracks. Their faces showed a mixture of nervousness and hope. "Yes." Her daughter's eyes brightened and her former enthusiasm returned. Not because of Mizore's talent, but rather because it still required work. The star was flawless. Then, Surara began, raising two fingers in the direction of the star. The star was flawless for a very straightforward reason. Surara channeled some of her Yuki and pushed it into the star, saying, "I suppose you do have a good reason to be here. Since Naruto can help you this much, you must be quite healed already." It gradually took on a bluish hue. The star was a solitary crystal of ice. Something that could only happen when a Yuki, Ona, had genuine intentions. Gently pushing the star back to her daughter, she said, "We don't want this melting now, do we?" Her daughter's face was filled with pure, innocent joy. By her daughter's side, Naruto's face reflected her daughter's, something she hadn't seen in a long time. All she could do was grin. Now then, since you seem rested enough, Naruto, do you want to find out what else you can help her learn, Naruto? She responded. She smirked subtly, and Naruto's expression of surprise was short-lived before excitement overtook it. Mizore's mother smiled and said, "Let's get started." If only Naruto could have seen Mizore's expression when he suddenly realized something horrifying at the last second. Kazushi arched an eyebrow. "I hate this place." His wife laughed back at him. They gave her a betrayed, irritated look. Her laughter only grew louder. She tried to stop, really, by gripping her sides a little, but everything returned to her as soon as she saw his pout. Kazushi muttered in disgust, "You know, I'm beginning to think that it'd be less trouble to simply force our way through." However, Miyuki recognized his predicament. In fact, it was a common one. Out of all the places she could have stopped, she had miraculously begun her seal work on top of a hole that had just moments before been covered in a layer of ice and snow. However, the weather had to be a pain in the ass. It began to hail, and it wasn't just tiny stones. Her head was the size of some of the absurdly large hail fragments. You could anticipate a sizable crater where they landed as they fell. All one had to do was land over a hole in the middle of the ice sheet, directly between them. As was to be expected, it had collapsed, leaving them at the bottom of a tiny hole. Even better, they had reversed all of their laborious seal work. She stopped to catch her breath and muffled the last of her laughter. She laughed as she glanced at her husband with her sparkling eyes. "You know, it's been a very long time since I've seen you pout." Her husband's expression changed from one of shock to one of softness. "Yeah, it has been too long, hasn't it?" Kazushi said solemnly, grinning sorrowfully. After maintaining eye contact for a brief moment, Kazushi sighed and got up to stand next to his wife. "Miyuki, how long has it been?" With a hint of old fatigue in his voice, he asked. "3 years? 5? 10 years?" Miyuki slapped him lightly and exhaled. "Hey, you're making me feel old again? You know who we are? We are." In a single swift motion, he pulled his wife over, put his hands around her waist, and sat her in front of him while she made her own pout and glared at him. Her indignant shout was matched by the sudden look of shock that flashed across her face, but she had to stop before she could come up with another answer because giggles were bursting from her lungs. She was thrashing in her husband's grasp, laughing as Kazushi's fingers ran over her sides on a playful, tickling warpath. She leaned forward to try to break free, but he pulled her back violently, pinning her arms beneath his. He didn't give her a chance to rest. "Stop." As she twisted and struggled, her plea was obscured by her giggles. She twisted herself as far to the right as she could and thirsted her right elbow back in a desperate attempt. "Oomph, OWWWW." His arms relaxed, falling loosely around her body, and his tickling ceased. "Was it truly necessary for you to do that?" he inquired. She gave another in response. "Ah, sheesh, all right." In a moment, he had his back to the wall and his wife pulled alongside him as he used both hands to gently nurse his stomach with one arm while maintaining a light, playful smirk. "Hey. Har. He swiftly but delicately wrapped one arm around her waist and twirled her hair with the other as it lay close to her top. He put his head on her shoulder and teased, "You wouldn't hit little old me again, would you? Don't tempt me." He smiled. They remained in their current position, lovingly embracing each other's company. Their bond had not felt so strong in a long time, and they both had little smiles on their faces that matched each other's breathing. They were still sitting on the icy floor when the sun finally set, their auras keeping them warm, and they could hear each other as they basked in the slowly approaching moonlight reflected off the glittering snow. She couldn't help but frown. Even though she was giddy with anticipation over what her daughter might do, she was still concerned about whether or not she was going in the direction she believed she was. Stealing away from them, she stepped softly on the snowy ground and watched as Mizore eagerly dragged Naruto ahead. She was certain that she had either died or fainted somewhere and was dreaming when Mizore approached her. In the many years her daughter had lived after her powers developed, Mizore had never once come to her for training. Instead, she had to force it on her each time. Then, she came and asked her for training. Mizore had been training extensively for the past 5 days. In fact, her daughter had come to her for training. As a result, after a minute of silent shock, she replaced her shock and joyfully gave her daughter what she desired. Initially, she had asked Mizore what she wanted to train in, and she had made numerous offers. You can only imagine how shocked she was by her daughter's response. Even though Mizore wanted to learn control, one of the more boring aspects of growth, her daughter had a look of unadulterated hope, and she couldn't bring herself to do anything but comply. Her daughter's determination remained unwavering even as she described the numerous tedious hours she would need to spend concentrating and meditating in order to further develop her control over her powers. Despite Mizore's quiet demeanor, she knew her daughter disliked sitting still and doing nothing for extended periods of time, so she was certain Mizore wouldn't follow through. Then, by the end of the first day, she had eliminated all of her doubts. She would return in the late evening to find Mizore still faithfully carrying out her instructions, even after she had left in the late mornings for work. However, the strangest thing her daughter had done in those few days was to avoid Naruto during her training, even going so far as to use a different location. She would have known that Naruto, who spent several hours a day assisting her at the resort, had been complaining to her about how little he had been seeing Mizore. She would just say that Mizore was preparing a surprise for him. It was not a comparison for yesterday evening either, when her daughter had nearly broken down their house door, rushing into their home like a pack of wolves were on her tail with her hands cradling her precious parcel. After all, even though it had seemed strange to her at first, she had known a little hunch from the moment she saw the shape her daughter was trying to make, and it had done more than just bring a wide, almost loopy grin to her face. It had nearly made her start jumping in joy. She knew at that moment, and even as she later explained to her daughter, with more than a little trepidation, what she really intended to do, she somehow already knew from her daughter's expression that it would happen. It was only a question of when. When Mizore and Naruto arrived at a small clearing, she stopped on a branch and smiled, her eyes widening slightly. Her mother's intuition had been confirmed. It would be today. Her daughter had discovered another field of snow whites. Unlike the one the village typically used, this one was denser, more covered. It was like a blanket of snow whites covering the snowy ground. So she was relieved that her fear had been unfounded and she wouldn't have to worry about anyone else finding them and making Mizore's day any less than what it would be. She laughed and saw Naruto's expression of pure amazement. Right now, the only way she could have improved her day was if she... Hold on. She smiled. Click, 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 click. She was aware that it was not a typical day. She had woken up earlier feeling a great deal of surprise or excitement, possibly as a result of an unremembered dream, or perhaps, she didn't care why. She felt something inside of her that she couldn't quite put her finger on, joy, glee, hope, as the chilly winds blew past her face, tickling and cooling her. The winds were so familiar, but they felt so different on this particular day. She was indifferent. Her hands trembled with excitement, perhaps from exertion, as she held her prize. What mattered to her was that she had finally succeeded. An exquisite snowflake with crystals. A tired smile tugged at her lips. She was gleeful, ecstatic, and overjoyed, so she stopped herself. Too many emotions she couldn't articulate filled her entire being. She shuddered, not from cold, but from euphoria, as if she were going to explode. She will never again be left alone. Mother always told her that she had to perform the ceremony with Naruto if she ever found the one person she wanted to spend the rest of her life with and would never dream of letting go of. A vow to be together forever was made during the Snow White ceremony. A field of snow whites, a small sculpture made of crystalline ice, and the person were all she needed. She glanced at the snowflake once more, gazing at it tenderly and joyfully before her smile faded because something didn't feel quite right. What if? She ruthlessly shattered her line of thought. What if he didn't like it? What if it was too easy? He refused. Would he? Her eyes narrowed as she focused on the snowflake, examining every last detail. She was painfully honest and sincere, and she would be damned if she made a mistake with a cheap piece of ice. It appeared flawless, uncomplicated, and incredibly simple. Her hands shook. It wouldn't demonstrate her effort or sincerity because it appeared too simple, straightforward, and tidy. No, she would never, ever be left alone again. Think. She screamed at herself. How was it possible for Mizore Shiryuki, a simple snowgirl, to express all of her feelings on a piece of ice? Squeezing her eyes shut, she concentrated on the ice in her hands, scrunching up all of her remaining knowledge and insight, as well as every last note and tidbit she could remember. Which sounds, smells, images, and symbols might be helpful? The snowflake in her hands changed slowly but almost surely, responding to her need, responding to her wish, and resonating with her soul. She felt a warm sensation envelop her right hand, as though a cozy presence had chosen to be there for her. She dallied for only a second before opening her eyes, wondering why she was on her knees and when she had held her breath. Her breath finally came when she finally stopped. She felt herself suddenly relax at that very moment, and she fell in shock. She let out a nearly audible, silent yelp as the brief shock passed through her body. What? Hold on. Her eyes opened in astonishment, and her mouth opened in a silent gasp as she pried her fingers open one by one, hesitating as they departed uncertainly, as though something had changed. If it had been lovely then, it was almost certainly beyond that now. She stared at what she held for another minute, speechless. Her legs then leapt. She didn't keep track, but when the familiar brown wood of her home door finally appeared, it seemed like too long had gone by. With a bang, she threw it open, and although she had a mental image of her mother reprimanding her, it was easily overshadowed by her primary objective. Mom. She felt a tiny sense of relief when she received a response. Mizore? She ignored the alarm in her mother's voice and moved at the sound of a footstep. Aid. The snowflake jumped, and her heart jumped as she instinctively grasped it, and for a brief moment, relief flooded through her as she threw it toward her mother, almost recklessly. Her mom just stood there. Why wasn't she doing anything? Mom? When her mother's worried and concerned gaze met hers, she realized, it was like a shock, that she was awake again. She saw now her panting, her likely unkempt, anxious state, her face a frantic glow of red, her lips dry, her hair everywhere, by the window behind her mother. She appeared disorganized. After a few seconds, she became acutely aware of her mother's predicament, and a faint, somewhat sheepish smile appeared on her face, though it was obscured by her anxiety. She stopped abruptly. She had no idea why, but something forced her to do so. Why? Her face turned abruptly, as if she had been hit, and she saw. The face typically stood for happiness and contentment, but this time it elicited an entirely different reaction. Eep. Her face flushed as she leapt. As if that weren't enough, she became aware of the sound she had just made, and her blush intensified even more, if at all. She pictured her mother's face as it gradually came into focus, the self-aware grin and smirk that always signaled one of her plans. She quickly grabbed her mother's sleeve and tugged, looking down as her face burned. Mizore? Oh no, it was too late for her, she choked. Yes, Naruto-kun. She folded both hands behind her quickly. Concealing her priceless creation from his view, she glanced up for a moment, taking in his shape. The evening sun's radiance was magnificently reflected off her golden blonde hair. His black pants and orange shirt were filthy, and the scarf around his neck was disheveled. She nearly jumped when he said, I haven't seen you as much usually. His voice startled her while she was studying. His question was filled with anxiety and a hint of melancholy. Is everything all right? It felt like a blow to her stomach. She felt a surge of guilt that began in her stomach and moved up to her heart and finally her throat. She apologized and looked into his eyes. Did he get it? She had wounded him, hadn't she, Cammy? Over the past few days, she had been pushing her one and only friend away in her self-centered attempt. For a piece of ice, too? Naruto. She was abruptly stopped by a pair of hands on her shoulder, threatening words and tears. Naruto-kun, she's all right. She's just spent the last few days working on her surprise. Do you recall? She seems to have put in too much work today. Before she goes to bed, I'll help her freshen up a little, okay? The guilt only grew as he gave her a final worried look that nearly made her open her eyes, and then he turned and walked past the corridor, gently nudging her away into her mother's room. He didn't seem very convinced, but he accepted nonetheless, giving a small unsure nod. With a loud click, the door shut, and she found herself in her mother's embrace once more. Mizore, don't worry. She pressed herself against her mother and sniffed, breathing in her mother's comforting, familiar scent, and then nodded. He'll understand, I promise, she said. What did you want, then? Though it didn't seem particularly abrupt when she thought about it, her mother asked abruptly. She raised her arms once more and presented her prize to her mother. I don't want it to melt. She briefly enjoyed her mother's wonder, her stunned gaze, and her quiet exclamation as she took in each minuscule marvel. Her mother's face softened, and then her eyes returned to hers, searching, seeking, as if she could see right into her soul. Her mother grinned, but there was a faint undertone of concern. Why? A tiny, dark terror tore at her. No, Mizore, it's time I explain to you what the Snow White ceremony really is. What? She almost lost what she had worked so hard to earn. The amount of thoughts, ideas, and what-if scenarios that were racing through her mind was overwhelming. She needed to think. Her head was between her knees as she huddled her own legs while sitting on her bed. Mizore, it's not just friends. She couldn't recall any other time her mother had ever been like that. Never. Her mother's words kept repeating in her mind, along with the slight hesitation she had carried and the cautiousness and uncertainty she had closely watched. Her mother's eyes had been filled with fear. She had trouble breathing. Her mother's eyes had been filled with fear. Even more than when the village had threatened her, her mother, had been genuinely afraid. She wasn't at all unnerved by her words. Her mother's eyes had been there. However, she had maintained that Naruto would be the one she would want if she ever had a choice. Back then, she had been absolutely certain. At that moment, her mother's fear subsided, and a tiny but persistent smile tugged at her lips. Then that menacing statement had been delivered to her. Then ask Naruto for the truth, Mizore. The truth? What? She thought of her blonde, his deep, happy blue eyes, his spiky golden hair, and the whiskers on his face. She had been with the boy for the last few weeks of her life. The boy who made her smile, who made her happy, and who made her laugh. I take it that he was her friend? No, she was his friend, correct? Mizore. Her eyes popped open. Nah, Naruto. Startled, she yelled as she quickly veered toward the door of her room. She swore that she must have accidentally left it open in her distracted state. His features were concerned. His hands were unclenched but rigid as he stood erect by the door. He said, Are you all right? But the question told a lot more. Where was the joy he usually exuded? Where was the joy and vitality in his words and deeds? He stood hesitantly on his feet and appeared weak and uncertain. How did everything vanish so quickly? Or did she only realize it now? Her heart tightened. An uneasy sensation crept into her heart. Regret, remorse, something felt wrong. She did, however, nod. His feet shuffled. Things worsened. He appeared so terrified and depressed. What sort of person was she? She nibbled on her lip. No. Her mouth stayed open, but when he spoke again, her faint murmur of his name ceased. Mizore, did I do something wrong? Her shoulders grew heavy, her heart clenched painfully, and she suddenly felt disgusted. Please. No, she nearly yelled. In an instant, she was in front of him, and before he realized it, she was skilled at it. She had thrown her arms around him. She repeatedly said, I'm sorry, while holding him as tightly as her small arms could. Am I? Before he could say anything, she said, It's not you, it's me. I haven't paid attention to you. You're not to blame. It's mine, she said, burying her head in his scarf and holding him firmly with her fingers while sniffing. As he took in what she had said, Naruto stood still and felt a slight sense of relief, but he encircled the snowgirl with his own arms. He whispered to the shaking girl, Hey, it's fine Mizore, it's fine. I forgive you, Mizore. The words caused her hug to tighten, and she rubbed her brimming tears into his scarf, leaving the dark blue fabric stained. His scent filled her nostrils, calming, warm, and comforting. A pledge? He grinned. I promise Mizore, I'll never hate you, I'll always be your friend. Constantly her friend. Her thoughts stopped. She cautiously peeled herself off of him, slowly removing his scarf. You'll be my friend forever? She asked, hesitantly and with tears in her eyes as she looked intently into his dazzling blue eyes. Yep. He grinned brightly and pleasantly. So, would you mind telling me the truth? She didn't even realize she had said it. Her mind appeared to have already reeled away in shame before she even realized what she had said. His body tensed, and he had brief panic attacks. His eyes narrowed, but she could now plainly see glimpses of what he concealed behind his fragile blue eyes, which never left his. Naruto, please? Once more, she pleaded in a whisper. He lowered his shoulders, he gave a nod. The reason she had seen her eyes in his was now clear to her. She now understood why they had bonded so strongly and why he understood. The pain was the same for both of them. The agony of being lost, alone, and unwelcome. To be despised by everyone around you, regardless of your desires, actions, or level of begging. These two were like-minded souls who had experienced similar hardships and had come together to meet and support one another. However, at least, you had your mother, Mizore. Through an agonizing smile, he had said that in a haunting, painful, yet knowing manner. He submitted to her judgment as he stood in front of her. He had admitted everything, even the parts he had attempted to hide at her insistence, her stupid, self-centered insistence. He described every horrific detail he could recall, including beatings, burnings, starvation, and humiliation. And his smile remained constant throughout. She felt regretted that she had made him relive everything and that she was the one who had made his eyes go frightened. But was it something else that made her feel different, or was she just happy? Some tiny part of her that was strangely relieved for some reason? Or did she just have a sick reason for being happy? No, it wasn't that. She knew in her heart that it wasn't just happiness, but what precisely was it? What was it that she was unable to explain, not able to put into words? However, you idiot. His expression changed from one of confusion to one of shock and surprise. Huh? Was the first thing that came to mind as he opened his mouth to speak. She nearly burst out laughing. What kind of person would I be if I turned on you when you accepted me? He sat motionless, unable to move or think. His whole being appeared to have been frozen, and his mouth was unable to respond. His blue eyes, which mirrored hers, never left hers. Her face then became blurry. His body trembled, his cheeks became wet, and he lost concentration. Thank you, Mizore. Well, in a way, it was a useless question. The face of her daughter was a clear enough hint. A subtle glow that emanated from her whole being. A soft smile that was practically fixed on her face, and the little skips that accompanied each step she took. Even if her daughter's behavior wasn't a clear enough clue, let's just say that she had a tiny habit of sneaking and listening in. She laughed to herself as she thought about it. I want to do it. She gave her daughter a smile. So Naruto told you his past? Mizore gave a nod. Have you told him? Her daughter blushed, paused abruptly, and then smiled sheepishly. Mizore muttered, I'm planning it as a surprise. She pondered for a while. She didn't get everything she wanted, but... She looked directly into her daughter's eyes and asked, Tell me, Mizore, are you completely sure about this? Even though they were slim, she could still imagine some things going very wrong. There wasn't any hesitation or pause to consider or reflect. Her daughter had answered. She spoke with assurance and confidence. Another second, and then she smiled again. You're going to need this. She removed her daughter's snowflake from her sleeve. I used the best enchantment I know of, Mizore. As long as you never let it run out of Yuki, it'll never melt. The snowflake was timidly lifted by her daughter's delicate hands as they reached for hers. Mizore's eyes glistened. Thank you, mother. Surara could only give thanks to everything as her daughter's tiny hands encircled her body and she slowly gave her a hug in return. Her entire life now lived in the house itself, she remarked as her tiny feet propelled her toward her objective. Or at least that was all that was important to her. Her blonde friend and her mother. She paused outside the door of her room. Then, as her fingers reassured her of her treasure, she touched her chest once more. She reached up for the doorknob, then stopped once more. Was there anything she was missing? Ice sculpture made of crystals? Verify. White field of snow? Check, and she was selected? Behind the door? She grinned and decided not to wait any longer. She found her one and only friend on the bed and pushed, almost shoved, the door open. Once more, he was meditating. Usually, she would be curious about how he accomplished it. It was true that she had recently meditated, but only to achieve her ultimate goal. Why would he need to do it each and every day? And more than once every day? He shouldn't mind too much, she hoped. She walked over to her blonde friend and gave him a gentle shoulder pat. She then bided her time. No answer. She gave it another go, more forcefully. She still didn't get anything. Oh no, she had no intention of waiting an additional hour. As though she were knocking on the door of a house whose occupants refused to open, she said, Naruto. Abruptly, a protracted moan emerged from his lips. He was momentarily distracted as his gorgeous blue eyes creaked open. They then blinked in her direction, and she was able to easily pick up on the slight irritation. He was her meek response, but as his eyes lingered on her face, his expression softened rather quickly. Yes, Mizore? He inquired, his friendly grin returning to his face. She considered a response, coming up with one halfway through before deciding against it. Rather, she seized his wrist with fervor and tugged before he had a chance to react. At his startled yelp, she stopped laughing. She pulled him toward the front door while he continued to stumble over his own feet. She glanced at his clothes. He was still dressed for the cold, which was good. Am I? Mizore? She quickly pushed him out the door before grabbing his hand again. She smiled briefly in response. After teasingly saying, Come on, she quickly took off, but she wasn't exactly running. She only needed to do it once, and she had committed her route to memory for that one time. She no longer needed to pull, but she continued to hold onto Naruto's hand. The field she had discovered a few weeks prior was stunning, unspoiled, and untouched by her village. It felt incredibly long now, even though she knew logically that it wasn't too far from her house. How on earth could a quick stroll feel like a journey across the globe? When she finally saw the flowers, it was like crossing the finish line of a race. She smiled. Her actions were influenced by adrenaline, and before she knew it, she had caused her blonde to yell again as she abruptly started running. Then they appeared. Mizore. He exhaled. Her feet were cautious as she entered slowly, prior to guiding him to the tiny area she discovered. Naruto. Mizore paused for a brief moment before turning to face the field and silently taking in its soft, ethereal vibe. Then she turned to face him. He said, What is this? As she knelt and pushed Naruto forward, she declared, This is a snow-white field. She gently guided his fingers along one of the white petals and slowly drew his hand toward one. She smiled and said, "It's beautiful, Mizore." Before she had a chance to think, she asked, "Am I beautiful?" He stared at her, and she stared back at him. His expression briefly mirrored hers as he flashed astonishment, but his response came as his features softened rapidly. "Yeah," he murmured. She couldn't quite understand them, but she felt her cheeks burn all of a sudden. She got herself back on track very quickly. She conceded that her mother was right. It was true that Naruto would always be her friend, but she couldn't be sure he would want more from her. The thought made her frown, which she had to suppress. But she was about to burst out laughing. "Naruto, will you promise me something?" she asked. Her world nearly came to a halt when he paused for a moment. Within a moment, an uneasy sensation had crept into her. Deep within her, from her heart to her bones. She only experienced uneasiness during that one moment. After that, it seemed like nothing else in the world mattered. She looked directly into his stunning cerulean eyes and said, "Anything, Mizore. I promise you anything." She felt butterflies in her stomach as he smiled tenderly. "Promise me that when I turn 17, you'll undergo the Snow White ceremony with me." "Snow White ceremony?" he asked, merely out of curiosity. She didn't see anything else. Her tone was slightly teasing when she said, "Promise me first." She would be able to go home without him having to make any promises. She moaned in her head at his light-hearted response. I said I'd promise you anything, didn't I, Mizore?" That promise was just what she needed. Then, she shot back, "Promise me then." "Why?" Her heart nearly stopped until she realized that his voice was always playful. She continued to smile. "Because," she said, but what could she explain? Her panic quickly subsided. Then, without thinking, she uttered the first thought that occurred to her. She noticed the growing curiosity in his eyes and said, "You'll get a little prize." He was all hers now. She smiled. "Fine." She laughed at his absurdly humorous grunt, which didn't really express irritation. "I swear, to go through the Snow White ritual with you." She exuded a profound sense of pure joy. She sensed it, but she didn't. She stopped smiling. Something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. Something wasn't right. She reached up and clutched her heart. Why did she feel so empty? She had been waiting for that one sentence so badly that she had even dreamed about it numerous times, but all the feelings of joy, happiness, and glee were absent. She cried. "No, no, no, Mizore." Two hands landed on her shoulders and firmly grasped her in spite of her trembling. "Mizore." The hand reached out and grasped her shoulders. Then her chin was abruptly raised. She looked him in the eye. "Mizore, what did I just promise?" he asked with an insight she was unaware of. No, that wasn't the case, but how did he become so adept at reading her? She briefly considered lying, but that thought was fleeting. Tears pricked her slowly. Her voice was almost a whisper. "I'm sorry." Once more, she heard her name called out with unadulterated worry and anxiety. Her guilt was only going to get worse. "I never failed to keep my word." God, why did it seem like she could only harm him lately? What was the matter with her? She could scarcely hear herself say, "You just promised to marry me, Naruto." Why? Why did it hurt to think about his eyes hurting? When he realized he had been duped. When he glared at her icily. Huh? When he what? She turned back to him right away. The only emotions that appeared on his face were confusion, curiosity, and worry. "Don't tell me," Mizore began. "Marry? What's marry?" "He has no idea what marriage is," mentally, Mizore exclaimed. She felt a surge of hope and thought for a brief moment. She considered all of them, trick, lie, and bluff, and then she stopped herself. No, she let out a sigh. She would only exacerbate it. She pushed her gaze onto him with tremendous strength. She made her choice while staring directly into his eyes. Her heart was racing. As she waited, every step she took felt like lead, and she felt every agonizing moment that passed between her and his response. She did not know where to search. Since she had explained, his expression had not changed. Calm, emotionless, and stony. She was more upset by it than she would have liked. She was unable to read him at all. It was as if hundreds of doors that had been opened to her only moments before were abruptly and violently closed. But even though she wasn't sure where to look, his gaze never left hers. There was something distant about his eyes, as if his body was present but his mind wasn't. The wait ultimately only lasted 5 seconds. He said, "Mizore," and she could see that his face cracked at the first mention of her name. As if the dam had finally failed and a flood was just waiting to happen. His words, "I admit, I don't like that you tricked me," went on. She felt her heart tighten. The world appears to be depressing. Was this the end? But, however, He was grinning by this point. I'm willing to try. I did say I'd promise you anything, didn't I? Her features were stoned with shock, as if the world had just accomplished something unthinkable. She stood frozen stiff. Had her food suddenly turned into something edible? Still, it took her a second or more. As she processed his words, her mind went completely blank. Then, in the next instant, everything flooded, and she drowned. She didn't think she wanted to stop herself, but she was unable to. A second after she threw her hands over Naruto, she was giving him a fierce hug. Extra energy, the kind that resulted from a strange combination of anxiety and joy, made her limbs tremble. An excellent combination. It shot through every aspect of her being. Overwhelming, intimidating every part of her. She felt the impulse to squeal, but the sound she produced was hardly that. Rather, there's a strange intersection between that and crying. An eternity seemed to have gone by. An eternity that she had spent in the embrace of her beloved, an eternity that she had spent open, vulnerable and experiencing a curious, painful, delightful mix of adrenaline, fear, nervousness and sobs. A tiny thought came to her somewhere. Why had she been acting so tearful lately? Her cries and her hold on his clothing eventually stopped, as did her shaking. In that instant, she answered her own question as she inhaled her friend's aroma and felt his warmth. Never with anybody else. Now, she only cared about two things in the world, and she only had room in her heart for her mother and the person in front of her. At last, she withdrew. Now she just had to do the ritual of the promise, and then nobody, no one, could question her assertion. Those from her village in particular. She created a single ice claw by fingering one of the Snow Whites. Her fingers brushed over its petals as she gazed at it earnestly, almost affectionately. She sliced the Snow White at the stalk with delicate grace. She closed her eyes and brought it to her chest, holding it there for a moment. She directed what little Yuki she had left into it. She held the flower in both hands and said, "Naruto, promise me." There were faint tear tracks on her cheeks and a smile on her lips. He was aware. He understood even though she didn't have to say anything because their eyes never left each other. His fingers sank gently into her grasp, and he slowly took Snow White as tenderly as he had treated her. As she lowered her head in front of him, he bowed slightly and gently slid the stalk into her purple hair before tucking one of her fragile locks behind her ear. "I promise, Mizore, that when you turn 17, I'll go through the Snow White ceremony with you. Until then, this is my promise." Her fingers reached for the priceless ice she stored beneath her kimono for the final time. As she carefully removed the snowflake that she had worked so hard to create, she whispered, "Naruto." As she saw the feelings that filled his face, a warmth spread throughout her. A simple dark blue cord, looped twice through a silver bale that supported her work, an ice snowflake. Despite its straightforward form, it contained numerous elaborate designs that portrayed a mystical scene of snowflakes. A field of snowflakes, just like the one they were in. With her mother's approval, her and Naruto's initials were beautifully inscribed on the bale. Her head cocked slightly, and her smile could only get bigger. She reached behind his neck and carefully knotted the cord, holding each end in one of her hands. She was so close to him that she could feel him once more. She felt safe and at ease because of his body heat, warmth, and presence. After that, she lingered for a few more seconds before returning to her earlier kneeling position. With his hands holding it and his head cocked down, he asked, "Do you like it?" His gaze appeared to wander over the expansive fields that her creation's details had portrayed. He let out a deep breath, a quiet exhale of amazement. "I do, Mizore." A slight apprehension that she had not yet recognized left her. She felt it, but it was hardly noticeable. She felt as if a tiny but heavy burden had been removed from her shoulders and thoughts. To complete this ritual, she just needed to do one more thing. Her thoughts vanished. It traveled abruptly, moving from a depth near her heart to her face. Her normally pale face turned bright red as it created a passionate burn in her cheeks. It moved through her entire body, down her neck, and under her clothing. A coziness. Did she have a hot feeling? How? She was surrounded by snow. Naruto, she merely dutifully mentioned that he had taken notice of her. What was causing her to feel warm? It made her toes curl, but it was unbearably so and not particularly unpleasant. Her mouth mutely parted as she considered telling him what they needed to do, but when she let out a breath, not a single sound came out. Her mouth was open, and she was gasping for air. She was still able to pick up on his eyebrow quirking, though. Normally, it would have made her smile a little with amusement because it was a synonym for cuteness that she had assigned to him. Typically, too much. She had the feel of a spring that had been overly tightly wound. Her fingers had formed small fists with her clothes, and her legs, which were still neatly folded beneath her, were tense. Then, she thought, his lips moved, perhaps in anticipation of her name. However, it made no difference what his motivation might have been. Too quickly, her attention had been captured. The only thing her body could do was follow. Squeezing her eyes shut, all she could do was wonder what had become of his. Shocked, wide, unblinking, similar to hers? She quickly called forth the smallest amounts of Yuki she could muster, barely remembering what she needed to do, in proportion to the quantity she had added to her flour. She noticed for a moment that, like hers, his lips were motionless and still on hers. It was nothing more than a chaste kiss on his lips, but it was still a kiss, and it was her first. Her stomach churned. It seemed timeless, a unique moment that would live on in her memory forever. Even when she forgot everything else, she would never forget the kiss she had given. As if, specifically for her, time had stopped. Then things started up again. The surrounding winds, the sounds of her surroundings, and even the weather itself. Her eyes remained closed as she drew back, then slowly opened them. She had a lot of thoughts, but when she eventually recovered enough to record his responses, she discovered that her mind was once again devoid of anticipation. It seemed as though all of her thoughts could only vanish and her mind simply refused to function. His face changed into one that could rival her own red hue, and she saw only faint traces of surprise and wide eyes. She was unable to do anything but react because her mind was in her own chaotic emotional mess. So she just stayed. Anyway, it was his turn to do something. His hand reached up to his lips, and she kept her eyes on them. As his fingers ghosted over his own lips, she wondered how he felt, like in a dream. His gaze was fixed on nothing as he stared off into space. He exhaled. What was that for? His gaze was on her all of a sudden, but it had moved so slowly and fluidly. Her tongue strangled her mental words, causing her hands to suddenly flutter together. As her fingers tried to twist into impossible angles, she realized that it was nerve-wracking. It's really difficult, but it's neither undesirable nor unpleasant. Why was everything so? Logical and rational reasoning, Mizore, rational thoughts. She cocked her head, as if her mother had actually said those words. She could as well have. She always received wise counsel from her mother. She heard herself say, it was to finish the promise. She nodded to herself. However, she found it difficult to believe for some reason. His face twisted, almost strangely, to express acceptance as well, and she could see his bewildered brow. She was also unable to fully comprehend a very complex display. So, very modestly, she pointed. His eyes followed. He pulled apart a tiny opening beneath his collarbone, just far enough to the side of his shoulder for him to see, and his hands trailed slowly at his scarf. Abruptly, she grinned. She had him. Miyuki asked no one in particular, exhausted. Really? Her husband was thinking the same thing as her. She muttered under her breath, I hate the weather. I hate this place, and I'm really starting to hate snow and anything that's cold and white. For the fourth time, days of their tiresome labor were about to be destroyed in a matter of seconds while they were still outside the barrier, and they detested every second that got them closer. Off all things, another avalanche, really? As he gazed down the falling mass of snow that was getting closer and closer, he could vividly feel, the nearly pulsating vein in his forehead. He asked his wife, so, what this time? They would probably notify whoever was in charge of the barrier they were attempting to breach if they expended the necessary amount of Yuki to stop the avalanche from their seal work. They would be forced to start over and have their work destroyed if they did nothing. Suddenly, your idea has just gotten very, very tempting, his wife said, her frustration evident in every word. He grinned. He had an idea, and he was totally cool with it. We're going with the fun idea then? His wife said, yep. He didn't have to grin more broadly. He then unleashed a massive burst of brilliant yellow flames in the direction of the approaching avalanche. In order to prevent any flying snow and to destroy their seal work, Miyuki complemented his move with a quick blast of her Yuki that encircled her in a sphere. In any case, their seal work was going to be pointless. A second stream of hot yellow fire followed the first in the next second, and the two soon became enraged. However, one stream was very different from the other. Miyuki's was more subdued. This wasn't her battle, she laughed. No, those who crossed her sweets had hers. It takes a very long time for someone to acquire intriguing eccentricities when they are immortal. As he shot fire at the snow, melting and vaporizing the ice in his targets, Kazushi's insane laugh reverberated across the landscape. He no longer even saw snow in his imagination. No, instead, he joyfully listened to the cries of the weak, pitiful snow elves who had attempted to exact revenge on him once more. They had attempted to make him shudder. He? A phoenix? Shiver from the cold? A busser? He was second only to the sun in his ability to create flames. As they heard his crazed cackle, he could see their terrified faces. no one would be safe. He was never able to complete his plan because his flame throwing was abruptly stopped by a blow to the back of his head. Kazushi blinked and then let out a nervous laugh, saying, "Idiot, the snow's already all gone and you know how much I hate molten rock." His wife preferred her clothes and shoes to be clean, that is, free of rock, because molten rock had a propensity to be sticky and splash. "Ops," he laughed nervously, his wife approaching. She shook her head a little and briefly met his anxious gaze before giving him a gentle kiss and taking off toward the barrier while giggling and teasing him for a few more seconds with her quiet laughter. Completeness, wholeness. It seemed as if he had located his missing component, a part he was unaware he had overlooked. His hand swung and connected with Mizore's as his feet moved slowly, taking leisurely strolls. They locked and twisted their fingers. He idly ran his other hand over the snowflake that was dangling around his neck. His eyes flickered for a second. Images flashed by, along with sounds, smells, and touches. Experiences from the last few weeks of his life, which had been both the shortest and the longest yet. What would Mizore be like, I wonder? Naruto pondered. Perhaps. Naruto. He blinked briefly. Kurama? How? He halted abruptly in the middle of his statement, as if Kurama had realized something else halfway through. Naruto furrowed his brow. After a moment of confusion, he pushed it to the back of his mind, but the mental connection was abruptly severed, and he was no longer able to feel him. It was never easy to find a lost thought, so he shook his head and tried to recall where he had been. He turned to face Mizore. Her hands were swinging slightly more than usual, her steps were accompanied by little gentle skips, her purple hair flowed softly as they walked, and her blue eyes twinkled ever so slightly. His eyes lingered and stared, as he so lovingly yet eagerly took in details. She was also humming ever so lightly, a strange tune that seemed to stick for some reason. As his eyes strayed from her hair to her face, down her shoulder, and to their intertwined hands, the corners of his mouth gradually lifted. He briefly closed his eyes and relied solely on her hand for guidance before allowing himself to submerge and spreading his senses throughout their surroundings. For a minute, he experienced contentment and serenity. After that, something occurred. His eyes snapped open. An unsettling tingle warned him that something was wrong, a deep, seated warning that yelled at him in the back of his mind. He never tried to stop walking, but his head turned to face an unseen target. Mizore stopped and looked at him after pulling his hand forward. Naruto? His hold on her hand tightened as her voice fell short of his ears. Even though he could see nothing, his eyes told him that there were trees and snow in his vision, but something inside of him told him otherwise. Mizore started to shake him, but she stopped in the middle when she saw that his eyes were no longer his typical cerulean orbs. With the exception of the ripples he could see in the sky and the two absurdly large bright glares that shifted in and out of sight behind the ripples, the world around him became a multitude of blurring colors, but most of them weren't shifting or moving much. For a moment, Naruto wondered why his eyes weren't burning with agony, even though his sight had started to shimmer as things he couldn't fully understand registered to him. But in the next instant, his eyes widened, an instinct kicked in, something deeply rooted in his senses, feeling returned to him, and he tightened his hold on Mizore's hand. We must flee. Mizore was barely given time, and the change in pace nearly caused him to stumble. Naruto. His legs ran at a pace that didn't register, and the trees faded into a blur, leaving far behind them the open clearing where they had been playing only minutes earlier. He was not in charge, he was not in command, and something inside of him just screamed. His feet pounded the earth beneath him, pace after pace. Down. He threw himself at Mizore and knocked them both down. Nah. Her wide eyes were fixed on the ice shard that had impaled itself into the tree where they had been just a moment before when she heard a thud that was dangerously close. Come on. Mizore hardly had time to comprehend her surroundings before she was hauled to her feet once more, and this time she followed Naruto's instructions without protest. She was suddenly blinded by a dazzling flash of orange and yellow in the sky that had bounced off the snow. Naruto. With one hand reaching up and the other in a death grip on Naruto's, she squinted her teary eyes. What? Her cry caused him to turn his head in concern, but he was hardly bothered by it because his eyes adjusted almost immediately and briefly glowed. I can't see. Her hands were covering her eyes and rubbing frantically because her form was broken, causing her to walk in strange, unsteady steps. He grabbed her in return right away. Believe me, okay? I can still see. Mizore nodded in response, then swiftly adjusted his gaze back to the path, scanning from tree to tree and object to object while keeping an eye out for any additional threats. Then everything in his vision turned white. Heat swiftly engulfed them as a wall of fire erupted behind them, reaching and curving around them in a great arc. Faint slivers flashed by his vision, Fleeting glimpses of deadly shards that flew about around them, from behind them, peeking only from the edges of the fiery arc, as though the fire was meant to protect. The snow melted and vaporized where the fires stood, and the land became wet around them. His untrained and overly sensitive senses were further overwhelmed by another surge, which caused his step to falter. This time, the surge was fiery, coming from in front of them and arching over them to whatever the wall of fire concealed behind it. He could just make out two hazy figures. His world became sharper and more detailed as his ears quickly produced the wide range of sounds that rang throughout the area, including fierce cackling, snow melting, trees cracking, and shards embedding. His problems then seemed insignificant as his mind abruptly ignored everything else and his senses returned. However, none of it captured his attention at all, especially since his mind's sole focus was the reason it had suddenly gone into overdrive. The hand he was holding Mizore's had been pulled down. Was that hell? As he watched her body fall face front onto the snow, her knees bearing the brunt of her fall, his hands seemed to move in slow motion, as if the world would wait just for them. The world? The world that hated them, was that it? His world seemed to drag, as if his eyes moved too slowly, and his body moved so quickly yet taking so long. Who had he so offended? He heard roars as the fiery crescent burned mercilessly, uncaring, unforgiving, merciless. To the snow woman he had become friends with, to the Yuki Onna who had fallen next to him. His vision was suddenly plagued by a plethora of nauseating colors, but that didn't matter. The shadowy figures he had seen were nothing more than meaningless silhouettes, and the off-thuds of icy shards finding their wayward marks were nothing more than slight thumps. What scared his soul so much now was all that mattered. Mizore, Naruto, 1, no 2, 4. Another, 10, 15, 30. He needed to think. How could he think? His mind raced, frenetic with thoughts, countless ideas, all tossed aside for another in the final seconds. No, perhaps, no, yes, he was able to control fire. His eyes grew wide. He raised one hand, supporting Mizore with the other, and looked at the fires that threatened his friend. He felt them, as he always does. The life of the fires, strong, hot, and fiery. He spread his control and his breath calmed quickly during practiced heaves. Stop. A sort of relief played on his lips as the fires wavered, shimmering as if their very life had been extinguished. His mental command carried weight. He was too relieved. He could only watch in horror as his pupils widened. Quit. His will was powerless, and the fires reappeared, more intense than before, as if they had a desire for retribution, to put out the one who had attempted to do them. No. His powers. Why couldn't he? He shouted while hurling his hand in crazy patterns and waving like a crazy lunatic. He was a fire yokai. It was like searching for a treasure for an eternity, only to discover that it was hidden behind an impenetrable wall that would not budge no matter how hard he tried. It didn't make sense. He saved a woman of ice as a fire? That was absurd. No, Mizore. His hands gripped her shoulders, trembling and prodding, as though to get the fallen Yuki Onna to say something else. She barely seemed to notice him when her eyes were slightly open. They were glazed, though. One more idea. In her true form, weren't her powers more potent? She would be more resilient to heat, wouldn't she? Transform, Mizore. Transform. It was like yelling at a dead body in the hope that, in some strange miracle that could not be explained, it would suddenly react. But only because it wasn't. She would be all right as long as she changed. Mizore. Transform. His rough shaking made wet splashes, but no one could hear them. He could hardly hear the mingling of all the thuds, crashes, and yells from all around them. Similar to how his cries and entreaties for her went unanswered. Then he was unaffected by the abrupt disappearance of everything. Naruto. The words seemed to come from a god in the stillness. His eyes turned blood red as a hand landed on his shoulder. Kurama. Murmured Naruto. His eyes widened to unbelievable proportions. His head whirled, and he gave his surroundings a fleeting glance. All he could see was his friend's absence. Mizore? Where's Mizore? With a simple wave of his hand, a circle portal appeared and he said, "Calm down. She's fine, for the moment." He saw Mizore through it, and his hand. What? We are currently in a part of your mind, Naruto. In here, time is within your control. I've already slowed it down as much as possible. Every hour in here is only a second in the real world. Kurama continued. He didn't understand for a moment. Naruto's breathing became more relaxed, and his heartbeat slowed. Gradually, the deafening thuds that had troubled his hearing stopped. He straightened slowly, blinking wearily. He unclenched his fists and finally asked, Why am I here? Kurama appeared to murmur, like swearing at something or someone. Then, in a sudden, heart-stopping moment, Naruto stared into the boy's blue eyes. His own crimson eyes gazed intently into Naruto's. A second, then another, and then, just a tiny bit, his hard eyes softened. There is a way to save Mizore, Naruto. He didn't say anything, though, as Kurama abruptly raised his gaze to meet his. Naruto held his breath. Kurama's face was only a few centimeters away from his, and he was breathing shallowly. Then he recalled. He lost his breath. He couldn't just act, he couldn't be careless, and he couldn't let her get hurt, not this time. He had to think things through. How? He asked, with certainty, assurance, and conviction. Kurama didn't respond. At least not out loud. Rather, he gestured to the boy's scarf. Naruto's forehead lifted. Wah. She has given you a mate mark. Naruto gave a slow nod. Kurama said, you also need to confirm your mark. Mate mark. The phoenixes also had mate marks, just like you do. Nonetheless, the phoenixes have a different system. Kurama raised one hand at this point, a fiery image of a phoenix burning proudly in his palm, in contrast to the majority of other mate mark. Using yokai that have only one stage. This is the initial phase. This phase typically occurs on its own and leaves its mark on the hands of prospective partners, those who are attracted to the phoenix, and vice versa. It was a general shape of a phoenix proudly displaying its wings, and Naruto's face flashed with surprise before he swiftly studied it, examining every detail. This mark is already on Mizore. Naruto answered, I've never seen this on her. Typically, it is invisible, even while it was being formed, but sometimes it manifests itself. It can also reveal itself if Mizore deliberately concentrates both her will and Yuki on it, Kurama said, pausing. But that isn't significant at the moment. However, she can be protected by the mark's second stage. This was the first time he had ever seen a phoenix choose a mate outside of their species, so he was a little unsure about it himself. It might grant her a resistance to heat to some extent, maybe enough to help her through this. How can I improve my Mizore score? An undertone of desperation. After glancing at him as if considering the implications of what he had said, Kurama got up and, without saying anything, gave Naruto a quick tap on the forehead with his finger. You will know. Images flashed in his eyes, emotions registered with his skin, and for all but a split second, he felt like he was getting older. His surroundings had changed again in the next measurement of time, returning to what he remembered. The water in which they lay had finally revealed its heat to Naruto. The fires burned all around them, and he heard the sharp thundering sounds of battle. Warmth. Mizore. As soon as possible, he lifted her out of the warm water, warm, at least to him, and held her in his arms. Naruto. He said, his gaze darting back to hers as he saw that her eyes were wide open this time, clear and unglazed, while his blue eyes trembled. Mizore. He genuinely hoped. I apologize. Suddenly, her whole face twisted as if she had been hit by a wave of agony. Then, a moment later, he could see the tears streaming from her eyes. Now he felt real fear as her hand lifted feebly into her sight. Like ice by a fire, it was melting. From the tips of her fingers to her elbow, there was some transparency in her hand. She seemed to be disappearing. She whispered softly, I'm scared, as her eyes met his. He wasn't sure to whom he had said, Shish. It'll be fine. He carefully repositioned her until he could grasp her hand. It'll be fine, Mizore. Using the knowledge and memories he had just received, he called forth his Yuki and channeled them in a traditional, almost instinctive manner. His mouth hovered just centimeters away from hers as he bent his neck. His mouth parted as his harsh, gentle breath touched her. Then he got going. Yuki stirred in his mouth and in his palm. A certain mist came from his mouth, and a warmth enveloped his hand that held hers. It slivered from between his lips like a faint, soft tendril. It floated toward her with a faint orange undertone before getting into her open mouth. It was gradual and slow. There was a slight glow in her pupils amid the tears he could see streaming from her eyes. It's functioning. His energy slowly swirled inside her, brightening his eyes. As his tears clouded his vision, a subtle yellow glow gradually oozed from her skin, defining her. She tightened her fingers around his. He gave her consolation. His grin, in contrast to her fear. It calmed her, put an end to her anxieties, and gave her confidence that everything would work out. She also began to believe it. He was in her, and she sensed it. She felt gradually reawakened, as if this were the first time in her life that she had ever been completely awake. His Yuki mixed with hers and moved through her body, leaving a trail of warmth in its wake. The sensation persisted. As it gradually rose into bliss, all of her thoughts stopped, and she saw a lovely world of white. She was light and weightless, as if she were just a soul floating in nirvana, and her anxieties and fears were nothing. It was bliss. Mizore. With everything he had, he shouted, shrieked, and screamed. His body flew like a ragdoll as it crashed through the snow. His voice was muffled by the fire's roar. His cheeks were dripping with tears. A magnificent tower of fire was in front of him. Every second, its columns of blending colors change. Red, blue, white, every color he had ever seen, and more he didn't know how to describe. He had been thrown backwards by its birth. The flames that had surrounded him were put out by a strong shockwave. The flaming tower, which proudly displayed its multitude of colors, had taken center stage, and all previous sounds of battle had ceased. His entire focus was on it, but for all the wrong reasons. His gaze was fixed on the flaming tower. Concentrated, disregarding everyone else and everything else, it gripped his heart like a chilly vice that penetrated his bones. His voice became hoarse, and moisture dripped from his wide eyes. Nothing remained, not even the thunderous pounding of his own heart, which was causing him great pain. Finally, he was out of breath. His body went limp, lifeless, and his legs gave way, causing him to fall. Nothing was important anymore. A shout. Was it his? A roar that was so loud and powerful that it attracted everyone's attention. Was he yelling? Did he scream like that? One more cry. He gripped the snow with his fingers. Was he there? It moved, shook, shaking as sobs wrenched themselves out of the pathetic crumpled heap that he saw before him, and he no longer had control over it, as if he were a spirit watching his body. Then his world vanished. Roar rrrr. One of the two intruders they had confronted was across from the Yuki. Ona, who had arrived. Many of them silently muttered some twisted form of gratitude to the creature that writhed in agony in front of them while their eyes cautiously observed the scene. Tiny smirks curled their lips. However, now that the firewall has been removed, at their captain's silent order, they nodded their heads. 12 of them ran aside, prepared to confront the intruder. Slowly, 4 of them prepared their weapons for the blonde who had fallen. They were abruptly blown back by a second shockwave. As her fellow snow women all fell into sprawled positions on the snow, the group leader hurried back onto her feet. She suppressed a curse. They were at risk from whatever yukai existed before them. She quickly created a lot of ice fragments in front of her fingertips, and then she raised her hand in preparation to flick her lethal projectiles. She didn't have the next second. A fiery face, just inches away from her own, exhaling fiery breaths. Half from shock, half from fear, her eyes widened as much as they could. She was already flying backwards at ridiculous speeds before even another expression could have crossed her face. Her abdomen was blossoming with a searing pain. URK. She was fairly certain that there was blood in her mouth. She opened one eye and peered down. Fear struck again. Her battle kimono, which was designed specifically to keep snow women safe from fire, was charred. The fact that her skin was only faintly red was a miracle. She focused and quickly covered it with a thin layer of ice. A crash caught her eye. A fresh sense of powerlessness washed over her as she looked up. She could only watch as her team was mercilessly dismantled through the dark patches that gradually filled her vision. Her will gradually failed to keep her eyes open, and the last thing she saw was another Yuki. Ona leaping into the battle. Surara. Surara was barely able to stand. She hardly cared as the heat swept over her. She had witnessed the events. 2 fire yukai suddenly materialized in her vision, racing toward her 2 kids while her kinsmen followed. Mizore was standing next to Naruto when her own people ruthlessly threw ice shards at him. At that moment, her heart had frozen. The 2 fire yukai then abruptly turned around, defying logic. While the other stayed behind to appear to sketch shapes in the air, the first rushed forward to unleash a wall of fire. At that moment, she wasn't sure if she should be afraid or relieved. She watched as her daughter fell to the snowy ground as the shards missed the kids. She had also come dangerously close to running out. She had only been deterred by the intruder's apparent hesitation. Among Yuki. Ona, Yuki's sensing was an uncommon talent. The number of her people who had it could be counted on one hand. There were 16 chasers in the group, but none of them could sense Yuki levels. But she could. It had really scared her. It was as if she were standing next to 2 oceans of boundless Yuki, surpassing all reason and analogy. Perhaps, and only possibly, she was only comparable to the Dark Lords, but even then, none of them had ever had an aura that seemed to pierce her innermost being, one that conveyed age and strength and made her realize how inconsequential she truly was. How could such a being have hesitated? A flaming column had already appeared where her daughter had been by the time she had even looked back. If a Yuki, Ona had a soul at all, it seemed as if the fire that kept it alive had abruptly gone out. She had lost her sense of what she felt. It wasn't exactly mind, deadening pain, but it wasn't the sadness she was accustomed to either. No, it was a completely different kind. There was a certain emotion that was both extremely painful and empty. Hopelessness? A void so empty that she was on the verge of collapse? Now that the boy she had grown so accustomed to was staring at her with such ferocity and strangeness, she wasn't even sure why she had suddenly trudged forward. It didn't matter about the rest of him. He wasn't completely orange, but the air was nipping at the flames. They were just orange flames that covered his whole body. They had no form. Maybe his clothes were gone, but they were covered. Even though his eyes were unharmed, they seemed to be burning like flames. Then his neck appeared. A necklace. The necklace of her daughter. A flaming creature stood in front of it. Surara screamed, exposed and without the will to fight. She sobbed for her daughter for the first time in years. Not after she vowed to never show weakness for her daughter. She fell to her knees, muffling her sobs with her hands over her mouth as the ground drew closer. She let out a painful, loud cry. The animal peered. Its eyes flickered as they gazed at her shape, unable to identify her. Its fire flickered, dying, growing as if it were fighting to remain ablaze. He heard her screams. His eyes took on a cerulean hue again, expanding as if it had only recently realized what it was actually grieving over. Surara, croaked Naruto. I am. He met her on his knees, unable to finish, his voice breaking as his own cheeks got wet. Suddenly, a third voice said, my apologies. Wearing a yellow kimono with golden rims and exuding a regal aura, Surara pulled Naruto into her arms and hugged him while crying. She could tell what they had come for because she was already aware of more of her kinsmen. They had hardly even tilted their heads to acknowledge her. There was no more time for her. She pushed him away while maintaining eye contact. He knew, too. She gave him one last kiss on the forehead. It was her final kiss as a mother. She realized that she couldn't go with them because, as an ice Yukai, she was meant to remain with her own people, and Naruto, a fire Yukai, was meant to be with his own kind. Their kind couldn't mix or be together. She relaxed. After that, everything happened in a flash. They flew out of Ona village, past the ski resort, and entered the mountains. It happened so quickly that he hardly noticed anything. A dimensional door. Meeting his new family. Meeting his grandparents. A new home. A new door. A much larger house. A room that was empty. It was getting dark. It had been a month. Kurama had already apologized so much that even if he wanted to be angry, he couldn't be because he was only trying to help. He sat on his bed, back to the wall, his fingers gripping it, tracing its curves, shape, coldness, his necklace, his only reminder of the place. His eyes were red and puffy from crying. He couldn't even be angry with his grandparents. They had both wanted to protect, not hurt, and it had been their fire on the icy shards. He picked it up. The necklace was still glowing with Mizore's Yuki, a faint blue aura that powered it and kept it from melting. In the dark, it could faintly light a few words. His grandfather, Kazushi, had offered to help preserve it, to increase its efficiency with his seals and prolong her power, but he had turned him down. The necklace was her gift, her work, and he wouldn't allow anything to change it. At the shortest, he had a few months, and even though he detested it, he had to take it off when he used any strong techniques. He would never be that weak again, a reminder of his past, but sometimes he wondered why. Surara. He laughed, a painful laugh, as if the world had stopped making him miserable. Only a week ago, one of his aunts appeared to have rebirth, accelerating from his presence. His grandparents had been careless at the time, miscalculating the time and leaving the door to the room containing her egg open. Shockwaves had marked her rebirth, destroying seals that could only absorb energy from within. He could just put dimensional travel to Surara's house out of his mind. By the time the backlash subsided, Surara would most likely have already died. The dimensional room had been flooded. A tap. He turned his head slightly toward the door, revealing his aunt's figure. Naruto. He didn't respond verbally. He assumed they were used to it by now. It had taken him so long to even regain some semblance of function. His nights were still filled with insomnia. Yes? Hitomi-san? As much as he hated it, there was still some dislike of her because her rebirth had essentially caused the final layering, that final finishing touch. He couldn't even go to Mizore's house now, and he would apologize as soon as he recovered. He saw the wince. He wasn't usually one for formalities either. She didn't seem to have properly prepared her remarks. Naruto simply looked back at the night sky through the window, gazing at stars that were so dissimilar. Not even the stars that Mizore had seen were visible to him. Before they discovered him, his grandparents had apparently been living on a floating island. And now he did, too. I remembered a technique that our human clan members had made in the past. It's not much, but it might help you a lot, maybe even find a way to fix the dimensional interference around us. She interrupted once more. After the first 6 words, she began to speak more quickly, but he was not surprised. Despite being centuries older, his aunt still resembled a child in many aspects. She was still considered a child in their race and had grown up in a tranquil period. He was most likely a very small toddler. But his upbringing had been very different. I understand that it's not much, but I truly, he raised a hand, thinking he was being childish too. He nodded, his gaze briefly meeting hers. He offered his aunt, thank you. His aunt's face lit up with a shy little smile, and she laid the scroll she had been holding between her hands on a table near his door before quietly closing it and walking away. He returned his focus to the night sky, his fingers still wandering around the snowflake. Another minute. Then he sighed. He slowly raised his body and allowed his feet to touch the floor. He walked slowly to the scroll, letting his fingertips brush against the paper, which was old and wrinkled. The texture of the paper told him that. He now noticed his aunt's disheveled, haggard appearance, the awkward strands of hair, the tiredness that had adorned her features, and kimonos slight out of place. He realized she must have looked for hours. As phoenixes, their yuki were not only too powerful for the weaker consumption techniques, but also too distant in terms of their fiery affinity for the neutral chakra that the human techniques required. He was aware of the size of their library and that the methods of their human clansmen from the past were not kept in easily accessible locations. He did, however, possess human chakra, despite the fact that his transformation into a phoenix had altered him to the point where he was devoid of human DNA. His body continued to produce neutral human chakra as a byproduct. This neutral chakra was incredibly powerful but still useful. He sighed again and unrolled the paper, letting his finger slide under it. Shadow clone method. Surara simply shifted her eyes toward the horizon as the sun was lowering and it would soon be dark. It was a dark day, with gray clouds circling the mountain she was on. How long had she been there? She wasn't entirely sure. As if it were yesterday, she pointed out that this was actually one of the things that people didn't understand until much later. One laugh. She assumed it was her daughter's favorite spot, her happy place, which she had created herself, not that anyone in her village would assist her anyhow, and they were probably celebrating. She balled her fists. She saw what had happened, but she couldn't hold Naruto responsible either. He had only done what he thought was best, and it was just a mistake. She also had a picture of her daughter and another of her with Naruto, one of the few they had taken. A cruel error. She allowed her gaze to return to her daughter, an ice statue glowing in the dim light of the night. Even though she was only in her 30s and had only a few decades left to live, she was extremely old. Perhaps it was time for her to retire so that she could do whatever she wanted for the remainder of her life. One more laugh. You know, one wouldn't usually find a grieving mother laugh. Sarera's eyes widened. She knew immediately who it was. Every Yuki. Ona knew her, having met her when they were all 17. The priestess of snow. Here, on top of one of the numerous mountains that encircled their village, outside the village barrier, what was she doing all the way here? Then she abruptly realized that she hadn't greeted the snow priestess, and even more, she realized that she didn't feel like it anyway. She wondered when it had happened, since she had always been such a stickler for rules, from as early as she could remember, faithfully marrying when she was told when she reached adulthood and then having Mizore. Ah. Her daughter. She realized now that she had already been transformed by her daughter, even though she hadn't realized it at the time. She assumed this was the moment her village abandoned her daughter. A soft chuckle. Her eyebrows went up slightly. Since when had the snow priestess laughed? She had never heard of it in her life, though she assumed that she was only a child in comparison. No one truly knew the snow priestess's age anymore. Only she would know it for herself. Surara-chan, I see a lot of things. Many, many things. Surara stifled a sigh. They were all aware that the snow priestess had the ability to see only a small part of the future. Isn't that painful? How are you feeling now? Surara genuinely wanted to strike her. Why was the snow priestess here now? She only intervened in matters that were extremely important to their village. Even her daughter's early awakening of her powers did not justify her presence. Surara-chan, you are aware. Your daughter was the subject of numerous visions and prophecies. Surara laughed once more. What was the point now? Her daughter was dead. Not even a body. Melted and vaporized by a column of fire. This time, her body trembled. Well, Surara, I guess I should tell you that they're still ongoing. All of a sudden, Sarera's world went cold. What? However, she did turn this time, facing the snow priestess directly, her face displaying a desperate expression of hope and pleading. Surara-chan, your daughter has a bright future. Joyful, inspiring, adventurous, and connected to that boy. The one you two saved. She felt a sense of happiness for her daughter, but then she started worrying again because Naruto had left with his people and there was no way to find him. The only thing she had was. Be careful with it, Surara. That feather they left you will eventually help your daughter find her true love. She gazed at the golden feather the female had left her, thinking it was a token of gratitude, that it would one day help her. Then she realized. Destined. As though responding to her question in her head, the snow priestess nodded. Surara. Chan, hurry home. There is someone waiting for you. She didn't need to hear it twice. She may have slid down the slopes even more quickly than she had that day, and she rubbed her eyes quickly after feeling something wet prickly. Before her house finally came into view, it seemed like an eternity, and she had already hurried inside without giving it much thought. Mizore, her daughter, was meant to be here, right? However, aside from herself, her house was deserted. The snow priestess frequently had a way with words, neither precisely specific nor precisely unspecific. She could feel the wave of agony, peaking, barely kept from drowning her. She closed her eyes. The snow priestess's house was empty, so it would be understandable if she was aware of her Yuki sensing ability. But her eyes wavered just a little bit, so rushed. She scanned the area, looking everywhere for her daughter, but she wasn't concerned about the battle signs and the fact that the place hadn't been cleaned up since she believed her daughter had died a month ago. Then she saw something strange. There was a puddle where the column of fire had been, precisely where her daughter had died. It was too cold for there to be water, so that didn't make sense. She stepped closer, and the puddle itself had a strange glow. It shifted. What on earth? Abruptly, the glow increased in strength, brightness, and warmth, and it started to rise in an oddly fascinating way, reaching an odd height before expanding sideways. It only took a few seconds for her to realize that the water was assuming the form of a person, her daughter. It appeared to settle into an ethereal form that glowed a little before gradually losing its transparency. She became aware of what was happening so late, shade by shade. It seemed as if time had stopped for a moment as her daughter's nude body stood there, glowing with a mystical power, her delicate hair, her face, and the pale color of her skin. Her daughter's blue eyes met hers as she let out a gasp. His crystal blue eyes opened to reveal an unfamiliar ceiling, and a pair of cerulean eyes snapped open at midnight. I'm on a softer bed with no springs jabbing at me, the ceiling looks different, and the air smells clean. Am I in the hospital after being beaten in the forest? No, the ceiling isn't white, and neither is the smell of disinfectant. He sighed. It was just another one of those nights. He had been here for about 7 years, a sizable island that floated indeterminately about in a small pocket dimension, and while the days and nights were normal, the ocean that surrounded the island was different. It was made of clouds, not water, and his grandparents claimed that they had never discovered what lay beneath it because they had grown tired of falling after a month. His strangely skeptical yet inquisitive gaze had also provided them with a fitting response. Indeed, he now had grandparents. It's funny how everything fell apart when Kurama, with his consent, created a temporary physical body and left his mind to welcome his grandparents. When they first saw his furry guardian, one of the 9 purportedly missing Uzumaki guardians, they were shocked and said, Kurama, sensei. After that, there had been some extremely numbing information. Kurama, his grandparents, and he sat around in a circle, and Kurama realized that Kazushi and Miyuki were also his grandparents. Kurama had somehow forgotten to tell him that he knew who his mother was until his grandparents' presence reminded him. Wary of exhaustion, he put his legs lightly on the ground and stood up, surveying his surroundings as his hand instinctively straightened his clothes, which included a pair of gray tapered pants and a black shirt with a red swirl on the back. He moved to the door and silently opened it, revealing a rather dark hallway that was only illuminated by the moonlight streaming in through the window at the end. The house he now lived in seemed much larger than it actually was. There was a single gravel pathway at the side of the mansion that wound through a wall of trees. There was a fairly large expanse of land surrounding him, surrounded by a thick wall of trees, and, as he looked up at the lunar moon, Naruto couldn't help but notice again that even though they were in an ocean of clouds, there were still some clouds floating far above him. After a brief journey through the maze, like corridors, he finally found the main entrance. The outside was fairly normal, and he wouldn't have known any different. Ironically, he was a phoenix, and he certainly loved the sun, but for some strange reason, he also loved the night. It was peaceful, a void with only the world's subtle decorations, and he just wanted it to calm him. It was a calm night tonight. When Naruto heard the word, crunch, he instantly spun around and looked around. While most people would have written off minor distractions, He had never had the luxury of that when he was younger, and he would have reacted appropriately if this hadn't already happened numerous times. Aunt? Her form slowly emerged from a nearby bush. She appeared to be as disturbed and exhausted as he was. Had a bad night, she said. A stroll? Though he was fairly certain that the question was unnecessary, he offered in a quiet voice. Hitomi nodded, then gestured in a questioning manner, and he merely began to move. It was a peaceful pleasure. Immortal people, or at least people who could live seemingly forever, were weird. When he looked at his memories of Konoha, objectively of how the people interacted with another, humans were simply simple, due to their lifespans. A normal child behaved curiously, playfully, and naively. An adult was older and smiled less often, their eyes more calculating and less open. Older people would seem pleased quite often, seemingly light-hearted and bored of life as their frail bodies limited them more day by day. To put it simply, people acted their ages, but if you applied this logic to a being who could live ridiculously long, things got a little weird. His grandparents behaved like adults, yet on more than one occasion he had seen Miyuki revert back into a child when she savored her favorite lollipops. Kazushi could become very wise in one moment and then in the next return as if he were but a young adult. Then there was Hitomi, who by all form of measurement was centuries older than he, yet she had failed to act her age in the conventional understandings 7 years ago. When he looked, it wasn't hard to see that her childish, innocent traits were still present, if not dulled. It was like a child doing the most ridiculous things, but things that made sense in some way, to make up for what they believed they had hurt. An adult would not have been as straightforward and uncomplicated as she had been when she had looked at him with her rightfully guilt-plagued eyes and a sorrowful face before she tried her best with what she knew made her happy to try and cheer him up and earn his forgiveness. Even though he was barely 16 years old, he was already acting like a very old adult, so he was not exempt from the rule. To be fair, though, his mental age could be calculated in 3 digits with all of his shadow clones and his cumulative mental age. Every time they ended their temporary lives, he would receive a few hours or days of memories to add. He laughed softly before he willfully ignored the curious look his aunt sent him. How are the repairs going? He looked at his aunt nonchalantly. Talking while walking wasn't a common occurrence, but it wasn't uncommon either. Almost done. Just a bit more tweaking here and there and it should be running soon. It turns out that while the Uzumaki memory hold was fine and still operational, the seal connecting their island to the other information databanks on Whirlpool had long since stopped functioning, and his grandparents had forgotten to fix them to check if any databank seals at the destroyed village were still functional. He returned to Kurama. His grandparents were over a millennium old, and Kurama? Oh, nothing much, just slightly over 2 millennia old, no big deal. It always baffled him, really, how there could be beings so old. How did they feel? He couldn't even recall what he had for lunch last Tuesday, though he'd wager it was ramen, and they had memories from over 1,000 years ago? What do you suppose we'll discover? He shrugged his shoulders. Kurama had insisted that it be fixed, if only to see if any surveillance data survived. In addition, Kurama wasn't entirely certain that Miyuki and Kazushi's hazy recollections of him and the other 8 were truly that. How is your other project going? He said, even better. Practically, he said, smiling briefly, it had taken me just over a month to learn all the tools of Fuinjutsu after discovering clones, and they had practically spawned a new seal master before their very eyes. He quickly realized that it wasn't a simple art, like teaching an artist how to use a brush and pen. If the artist couldn't see what he or she could make with the tools, the artist couldn't even be called an artist, much less a master. Soon after, he was shown the seals they had been using to travel dimensions, and after hearing the reasons why it would no longer work, he quickly made the decision that he would not accept it. He would not allow the opportunity that his loss had given him to pass him by. Kazushi, who had been the one to bless Naruto on his project 6 years prior, knew that Naruto had been working on a new seal to breach the other dimensions, but he hadn't really seen it in its entirety until now. Shock and pride filled Kazushi's mind as he stared at the intricate work laid out before him. It took his breath away. The 3 trees that stood in clearly marked circles, their trunks thick and sturdy, a few meters in diameter, their crowns shading the entire work of art, and their roots crawling and crisscrossing over one another in a complex puzzle, had taken on the shape of an oval as they covered a vast clearing in front of him. The trees around him rustled and swayed to an invisible wind. Even with the green lines that ran down the tree trunks toward the roots and then to the seal they stood in, they were grand, powerful, and majestic. The lines resembled pathways that pulsed with energy, and the seal's outline glowed a faint green. Nearer the center, a circle of purple surrounded a wooden door. Purple and green lines were scattered all over the door, pulsating every so often, almost like they were alive. As the clones finished extracting the last of the seal, he heard the distinctive puffs of his grandson's clones dispersing, and he smirked instinctively because only their hearing could still detect it after all the refining Naruto had done. It was a remark he had to make because his shadow clones were a truly amazing gift. In addition to finally becoming a Fuinjutsu master, Kazushi muttered, if he actually pulls this off, then this be one thing he's better than me in. It made everything he had ever done with seals seem easy. Miyuki was equally astounded, and as they attempted to decipher the seal in front of them, their jaws were hanging rather limply open as the realization of what was about to happen struck them. Even though there were a few remnants of his seal strewn throughout the seal, even he was perplexed because the enhanced seal he himself used for dimensional travel was nothing compared to his. The presence of his daughter was similarly much less obvious. Hitomi never finished her sentence. Ka.san, 2.san, wh. She wasn't as knowledgeable about seals as her parents, but she could still pick out a few things here and there. It wasn't that she was amazed, but rather that she just knew, a sort of aura it gave off that marked it as a wonder. She quickly realized what had happened somewhere in her mind, and she smiled. He had finally done it, and not too late either. They had had a pleasant walk last night. Hitomi, Obeken, Miyuki, Sobo, and Kazushi. Sofo, the three turned to see Naruto approaching them, and they all noticed a certain liveliness in his eyes, as if he had been dead the entire time he had been here. Is this what I believe it to be, Naruto? As he struggled to read more of the seal on the ground, Kazushi asked inane questions. Naruto replied quietly, yeah, before turning back to face the seal. He didn't want to think that it might not work because it would be extremely painful after all the positive signs that it had shown, but precautions were precautions. There are barrier seals in place in case something goes wrong, drain seals in case there is on overload, and an anti-personnel seal just in case. Like Sofu, my seal will build a tunnel through dimensions, but it can also connect to several dimensions at once. Kazushi's eyes widened as he paused his analysis of the seal to look at Naruto. For some reason, he knew that he had unintentionally boosted his grandchild's self-esteem. The primary distinction, though, and the reason this will work, is that the inner tunnel will be covered with an outer tunnel composed of natural energy. I discovered a few months ago while experimenting with nature energy that it is capable of influencing other forms of energy to synchronize with it. Kazushi and Miyuki were both astounded because, centuries ago, they had thought it was impossible to harness and use nature energy with seals because it was simply too powerful to bend to a seal's direction and nature didn't like to be disturbed. How did you? Nature energy is too powerful for seals to directly coerce and siphon. The fading question never had to be answered. I used my human chakra to grow those 3 trees. They feed directly on the collector seals and are connected to them through their roots and trunks. Thus, the seals will be able to channel the energy of nature, provided they do not bend too sharply. At this point, Hitomi was completely lost and nearly cursed at her curiosity. Fortunately, her mother noticed that her head was becoming a little lightheaded. She gave her mother a grateful smile while steadying her head with her hands. Basically, Naruto's seal will create a dimensional tunnel and protect it with an outer layer of nature energy to prevent disruptions from other energy waves, in this case the reverberations from your leaked energy. Aren't you ready to go already? Kazushi remarked. Naruto's clothing had told him that. His query was addressed by Naruto's nod. One day prior to our arrival. He nodded once more. It was Fundamental Seal Survival 101. Since new seals were always vulnerable to unforeseen circumstances, they couldn't possibly risk all of them at once, and it was customary for the person who created an Uzumaki seal to be the first to use their creation. What will the tunnel lead to, then? Miyuki inquired. Before tapping his necklace, Naruto grinned wistfully and said, hopefully whichever dimension this energy signature came from. She took a breath. Oyakata. Sama. Her old fingers curled slowly around the cup that was presented to her, bringing it to her lips gradually before she took a sip. How much time had passed? She returned her cup. She could recall a time when she was at her best, when she could cast spells every day, when she still had her vitality, and how she would laugh heartily as her friends joined her in casting spells that seemed to come naturally to her. She peered out her window at a stunning field of sunflowers that stretched as far as the eye could see. Then, just as easily, she had been told to flee, to hide, to give up. As a master, one of the 3 Grand Masters, she had been told to flee like a child, and her 2 fellow head witches had all but abandoned her because they had suffered a few minor losses against the humans. Couldn't they see that they were fleeing from humans, pitiful little things that couldn't even comprehend magic, much less use it? Since she was the only thing standing in the way of the avaricious humans, it was only a matter of time until she succumbed to the toll. They had overruled her and taken her own forces overnight, taking everything from her. Then she had run away. She let out a sigh. Her lips curled, one of the last things she had left, and she closed her eyes and let herself sink in as she always did. The welcome sensation of her plants registered in her surroundings, and she felt everything they felt, every gust that pulled and every breeze that pushed. Her eyes snapped open. Oyakata. Sama? Her child's worried eyes were fixed on her. She turned her back on her assistant and gave a sharp order, muttering only a few expletives under her breath. Prepare yourself. She soon saw the very sunflowers that she had connected to just moments before as a green circle appeared around them. Despite her advanced age, she was still skilled at nature magic, and she squinted and glanced at her plants, finding nothing out of the ordinary. With a quick glance to her side, she allowed a tiny smile to appear at the sight of her resolute apprentice. Be ready to fight, she said, gathering magic in her hands, an old instinct she had relied on decades ago. She recalled that day, decades after she had found her present home, when a magical signal had reached her while she was caring for her plants. Small, large, small, it had been a call for help against humans. It was a clear memory of how a bitter taste had filled her mouth. She had cast a teleportation spell and appeared at the location in a matter of seconds, unleashing her most deadly spells upon the vile creatures. For a brief moment, she had nearly forgotten that war had been declared decades ago. She stared in a daze until a moan caught her attention. As her eyes took stock, horror welled up inside her. He wouldn't live, it couldn't be. She had met a warlock who was crying on his last breath. He was struggling to get her attention, his fingers bloody and shaking, both legs reduced to mere shreds, and his chest pocked with bullet holes. The condition of the witch who had been behind him had not improved. Her focus was swiftly returned to the man when she felt a tug on her leg. She pondered her appearance at the time. She had followed his finger to an overturned car, and at that moment, fear gradually filled her, almost as if she had anticipated what she would see. The whisper had been so faint that she had almost missed it, but she had heard it, and at that moment, her heart had tightened. Mom? Dad? Oyakata? Sama? The sound of her adopted child's voice jolted her out of her reverie. Two sprouts appeared out of nowhere before her widening eyes. It was captivating to watch how they turned and twisted as they gracefully transitioned from birth to adulthood in a matter of seconds. Once they were a respectable height, they started to curl and touch each other so gently that they intertwined and formed an arch. The air around the young trees magically rippled, as if it were water and something had disturbed it. She had stopped in those brief moments to just look at her reflection, and then her image was ruined. First a leg, then a thigh, and then a whole body. It was successful. The way she heard it, it was a whispered, incredulous cry. It was quite puzzling that she was unable to identify the species of the being in front of her, but most prominently, she felt fire. Then, as a strange minor presence, she detected ice, and finally, she settled her gaze on the elated teenager who had abruptly made his presence known. He was wearing a dark golden shirt, and his bottom was dressed in tapered blue pants. His hair was the same shade as her sunflowers, and his cheeks were adorned with 3 whiskers on each side. Her eyes narrowed. He possessed the same kind of energy that only humans possessed, perfectly neutral Yuki, but it was far denser and in quantities that no human could ever possess. His neutral Yuki stores were on par with the most she had ever channeled without failing in her prime, and his fire attributed pool felt like an endless ocean, ridiculously dense as well. It was strange, though, that he bore no traces of nature energy, as that was what she sensed was driving his spell. For now, she would refrain from passing judgment on his species. The young teen didn't seem to notice her until now. Well, hi there? She thought tact would be a good option. Hello, Ruby. Chan is at my side. My name is Oyakata. Who could you be? My name is Naruto, he said, raising an eyebrow. First impressions were formed quickly, and he didn't feel like a great conversationalist. The only sound in the silence was the soothing music of her plants, and she just stared at him as his eyes darted between her and Ruby. This continued until his head abruptly cocked. His feet turned swiftly, but halfway through, he stopped and then returned his gaze to hers, as if a question had boiled up inside of him. He glanced at Ruby, then back at her. May I sketch a couple seals for you? Seals? She wasn't sure what he meant, and for a few seconds she searched her memory. Something rang, very faintly, just a fleeting memory of something her teacher had said back when she had just started her journey in magic. Seals, seals. It was one of the various ways in which energy could be manipulated, like her spellbook and Ruby's wand. If she remembered correctly, though, it was also one of the more obscure branches of magic that everyone had dismissed as cheap party tricks, possibly because no one had ever achieved anything noteworthy with seals, and she had never been interested in it. Since she had nothing better to do every day, she saw no harm and believed that even the most basic things could pique curiosity. She grinned and said, No, not at all. Of course, he was unaware that she would kill him if he damaged any of her plants. He gave her a thank you smile before completely turning away from him. She had anticipated a brush and perhaps a piece of paper, similar to how her few lessons on the subject had been, but instead he simply placed his hand on one of the sprouts that had grown. Ruby watched in confusion, but she could sense what he was doing. The unidentified energy he possessed had leapt into action, as lines of blue energy spread out from under his palm to cover the entire arch, forming distinct symbols and shapes. When it was done, she heard a single, unified cutting sound as the blue lines quickly dissipating their impressions in the wood. She arched an eyebrow because none of the symbols or forms looked even vaguely familiar. But what really took her by surprise was the next moment. With a quick tap of his fingers, she felt her home's natural energy flow being disrupted once more. Before she could ask him what he had done, the ground shook in front of her, and just like before, another tree appeared. This tree was directly behind the arch, but unlike earlier, it had grown far above its first two siblings, enveloping them and creating a small hollow that could accommodate a few people around the arch as it reached unnatural heights. She doubted that his actions were motivated by their amazed eyes, but she assumed the intended effect was that the portal now felt much more stable. She needed to unearth some ancient, antiquated books. After an afternoon of fascinating conversation, the most entertainment she had had in decades, mind you, she came to the conclusion that his appearance was highly deceptive. She glanced again at the portal, as she had called it, because no child should be able to make anything close to what he had done. If one were to look at him on the street, he would appear to be an ordinary teenager. What she had created out of all of this was interdimensional travel, which was not only a first attempt at travel but, according to Naruto, a highly experimental but also more sophisticated version of an earlier technique. It was also his proof, based on what she had learned, that he had at last risen to the position of Seal Master by the standards of his people, though she wasn't sure which people. However, because the portal was still in its experimental stage, it was bound to have issues. It had been a day already, and it seemed that Naruto's company ought to have followed him, but they didn't. She put her hand on the tree that contained the portal and then slowly extended her senses into it, letting only a small portion of her power in at first, crawling and wriggling as her tiny line of energy dug deeper and deeper. She gasped after that. The flow of natural energy throughout the tree, no, her entire house, was so overwhelming that it gave her a level of clarity she had never known before. It was as if all of her past mental ties to her house had only been fleeting glimpses of what might have been. Her home was rich and fresh, and she felt younger than she had in decades. She could see, no, feel Ruby showing Naruto around their home as gentle breezes caressed it, leaves ruffling played a tune, and a sweet scent wafted through it. She took a deep breath, the rush of energy euphoric, and she started to carefully go over every connection she could sense with the portal. When checking for a problem in a spell she didn't know, there was only so much she could do, like being told to look for a problem in a seemingly perfect model without a reference. The nature energy was fine, untainted, and even stronger than before he had arrived. The portal itself seemed to enrich it. She raised a hand at the portal, and after asking herself a few quick questions, she allowed a tiny hint of energy from her finger to shoot into the portal. She looked at the portal in its wholesome, which was flat and shaped like a disc that floated vertically above the ground. It was completely transparent, unlike many other portals she had seen, and only the occasional shimmers from its ripples gave it away. She held her breath as it simply vanished as the portal hardly shimmered any more. A moment later, she quickly waved her hand before the very energy she had fired stopped in front of her. Her eyebrows went up, and she picked up a tiny rock and tossed it in after looking down. It emerged again. Well, I'm fairly certain that's not meant to occur. She let out a sigh. In any case, nobody was really using her house's spare room. It was unlikely that the rest of the magic community would know more about seals, so she tossed the idea around for a while. She hadn't been able to learn much about seals from her books, and it wasn't surprising that she had only remembered that seals were regarded as a rather nebulous and abstract branch of magic after that. A demonstration? Naruto asked blearily. The boy in front of her possessed a wealth of information about seals, and the opportunity was right in front of her. Yes, considering how little I know about seal magic. If I can't understand how you made your portal, I won't be able to assist you in determining why it isn't functioning. He paused visibly, the air suddenly cold, and she inhaled deeply. Are you interested in learning about seals? His voice was threatening. Although most magic users outside of the main magic community tended to guard their secrets with ridiculous ferocity, it was extremely uncommon to come across one that actually bore knowledge outside of the magic community. She nearly bit herself because she had forgotten. Yes, but if you're not comfortable with it, she said, supporting herself with her palms up. His face contorted from internal conflict, and she could see what was on his mind. Perhaps I could make a suggestion, a little of what I know. There was a flicker in his eyes that she nearly missed. What about the energy of nature? Maybe I could share some with you in this area that we both work in. He smiled. If you could teach me nature energy, I'd be very grateful, but, he paused. I honestly have no clue what it is other than the fact that it's a difficult energy to manipulate. She was certain that she heard a crow cawing somewhere, but she wasn't positive. Oyakata gently put her palm on a short vine and skillfully willed it to grow to her level. His response was brief and tinged with confusion. Lady Luck is on your side. She was the only expert in the field because, even in our magic community training program, 75% of students consistently lost at least one limb due to petrification. Only a few others, including herself, were able to draw even the energy into their own bodies and be free of the constraints associated with using an external focus. All of her kind used nature energy, but they channeled it through mediums, such as a wand, book, and for him, his seals. But it was much less taxing to use a book, however, that wasn't the purpose. After that demonstration, it was all too simple to persuade him. Her senses were merely tickled, and she opened her eyes. Absurd. It had only been a few days, and no one could possibly learn that quickly. However, she was aware that her senses were accurate. He had already mastered the art of stillness and quieting oneself to the point where nature became noisy. Practitioners of nature energy were always able to recognize one another. Only they had souls that flowed with nature. Souls so in tune with the natural world around them that it seemed as though their very beings danced with nature. He had become a part of the world and had found peace with nature, no longer a rock that stood in the way of the natural flow that surrounded them. He was breathing calmly, and even before she saw it, she could tell that their breathing was in sync with the rhythm of nature as they sat across from one another with their legs crossed and in contemplative positions. Then everything went wrong. He had paid the price for her brief lack of preparation. Naruto! She yelled, but deep down she knew it was too late. Her garden was lacking too much nature energy, and by the time her hands touched him, all she felt was cold rock. No, hold on. Her senses tingled, a faint presence, so she looked for him, hoping and searching for anything she could cling to, even the smallest remnant of him. She took a deep breath, realizing that it was never easy to force nature energy to work. Then she discovered him. A very slight trace of one of his energy signatures, ice, was all she could detect. He had quickly gathered all of her strength and cunning, and she pulled in the next instant. The moment was fleeting. With reflexes she hadn't used in decades, she tore herself away from the boy, and thankfully, in time, a column of fire erupted. She conjured a barrier between them, and the flames licked at the very edges. The icy energy gave, and the tiniest traces of his other two energies suddenly registered, as though the icy energy had been shielding the other two. The aura then flooded the area, and she nearly dropped her barrier in shock. The aura's overwhelming presence was unreal. It wasn't even malevolent or oppressive, just overpowering in its power. She watched as the fire began to change and take shape before her, and while she had witnessed many magic users use fire in her life, this was nothing like it. Suddenly, as if it were a solid, it took on a shape, and it nagged on her memory, gnawing ever so slightly on things she could vaguely recall learning at the Magic Academy when she was in her teens. It had then flailed its wings. Her gaze expanded. Yokai have a very long history that dates back hundreds of thousands of years to the beginning of creation, when the creators chose to create the first few yokai. These were the ancient houses, the vampires, werewolves, and dragons. Those who could take over the powers of their enemies. Those who could hunt anything and everything alive. And those whose dominance of the skies and wisdom would never be questioned. Their motivations were never revealed, and as the millennia passed, the creators themselves gradually grew less involved in the affairs of their creations. Though they are loosely classified as yokai today, it should be noted that phoenixes are and never were yokai. Their presence had long since vanished from the world along with our creators. One significant point of interest, however, was that the creators had not been the only ones to exist before the yokai. According to what is known about them from the time, legendary beings of flame had existed alongside the creators. Little was known about these immortal beings. Phoenixes had existed alongside the creators. Her eyes grew wide as she recalled that in their history books, there had been a painting of a phoenix. Was Naruto a phoenix? What was a phoenix doing in this place, and learning from her, of all things? The column eventually died out, and as the smoke cleared, she could see a form emerging. She inhaled deeply. He was fine, though unconscious, and she couldn't be certain that he had been a phoenix until then. Phoenixes were supposed to be incapable of actually dying, only reincarnating whenever they were mortally wounded, so seeing his reincarnation was more than enough to convince her. He let out a moan. A ridiculous recovery period. He rubbed his eyes groggily, as if he were really waking from a nap. Naruto. What happened, Arg? That was her question, after all, and she grinned.
That's it for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this great story. See you in the next one.